I spent hundreds of hours watching videos, reading documentation, talking to expert designers, and with all of that combined, I'm proud to present to you the ultimate guide to Marvelous Designer. I know this sounds very clickbaity, but I will cover the most important tools in the software to the best of my knowledge, with useful tips and practical examples along the way. And by the end, you'll be able to create an outfit like this from scratch. We'll start with the basic overview of the UI, then dive deep into the tools and what they do, before creating Lara Croft's desert tank top outfit. This way you can always refer back to the first part of the video for the concept and tools, and the practical part would be to consolidate all of that knowledge. Since I'll be packing as much information as possible into this single video, feel free to rewatch the video or parts of it as many times as you need, and ask questions in the comment section if you're stuck anywhere. I recommend that you first watch the video in its entirety to get a basic idea of everything, so that when you follow along with the example later, it'll be much clearer. To get the most out of this video, I suggest that you use it as a guide for the tools and concepts. Take an outfit from a video game or anime or movie that you really like and try to recreate it. I've broken it down into chapters and I've provided timestamps throughout the video, so you don't have to rewatch the whole video again for some specific parts. Now, whatever you create after watching this video, if you post it to any social media platform, just tag me because I'd love to see what you guys end up making. If you need a super quick introduction and want to learn how to create simple garments and import and export between Marvelous Designer and Blender, you can watch this video on my channel that goes over that in just 10 minutes. But note that it showcases an older version of Marvelous Designer, and there have been a lot of improvements since then, which I'll talk about in detail in this video. This is what you'll see when you first open Marvelous Designer. The small dialog box will have a few basic settings like the units you want to use in the project, the language of the UI, and the navigation controls. The default one is regular mouse, but I prefer using Maya as it feels more familiar to me across all the different software I use, so I can recommend it as well. Under the graphics option, the higher you set the anti-aliasing, the smoother the edges of the objects will appear, with a little bit of increased hardware utilization. VBO stands for Vertex Buffer Object, which basically means that the information required for rendering an object is pre-uploaded to the graphics card and accessed later when needed. You'd usually want to keep this box checked for optimal performance. Hit OK and you'll be presented with the main UI of Marvelous Designer. We still have access to all the settings we saw earlier and much more in settings preferences. If you're opening the software for the first time, things may look a little bit intimidating to you, so let's first go over each of the panels and break them down. The main two spaces where you'll do most of your work are the 3D and 2D windows, and modify settings using the fabric and property editors on the right. Any of these windows can be customized by using the drop-down menu. You can collapse the menus by clicking on this arrow and expand them again by clicking on their names. You can also duplicate them using this button and then resize and position them however you want. It's also possible to stack them either in the left or the right panels or group them in the same space depending on where the blue indication appears when you drag and hover the menu over the other menus. On the bottom, there's the animation editor, which we'll get into at a later part in this video, so let's collapse it for now. If you change too many windows and you're feeling a little bit lost, you can always click on this button at the bottom right corner of the screen to reset it to default layout again. If you've selected Maya as the viewport controls preference, you should be able to hold Alt and left click to rotate, Alt plus middle mouse button to pan, and Alt right click to zoom in and out smoothly, or just use the scroll wheel to zoom in increments. For the 2D window, it's the same, except there's no rotating because it's just 2 axes. On the left, you'll see the library panel with a favorites sub-panel on top. You can navigate the library of pre-made assets here manually, or you can also double click on any of these favorites to directly open that folder. You can drag and drop anything from here into the 3D window to add it to your project. Here I added an avatar into the project, which is any pre-made character or object that you import into your project to have your clothes interact with. It'll be clearer when we actually start adding the clothes. You'll notice that if you try to add another avatar, you'll be presented with a dialog box that asks how you want to load it. The first method is open, which will override whatever you have right now and open the avatar in a new project. The second method is add, which will add the avatar to your existing project with a position you set here. The third one is load as morph target, which only imports the pose of the avatar and creates a transition between the existing pose and the newly added pose with the length that you set here. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, you'll rarely ever find yourself using this method even for animations. You can also import characters and props from other software by going to File and then either going to Import or Import Add menus to import an avatar. Now let's go over the display modes that we have here in the 3D space related to the avatar. The first button here switches the viewport to render at a higher quality with more accurate lighting and shading. Hovering over the fourth one, you'll see options to hide or show the avatar, show the arrangement points on the avatar which let you wrap and position a garment quickly, show the bounding volume for the mesh which can be manipulated, and that in turn updates other link properties like the arrangement points. You can use this to show or hide the joints of the character, which can be used to pose the avatar directly inside Marvelous Designer. Then there are options to show or hide the avatar's measurements, show line, which is used to show or hide what you've created with the line tool. And don't worry, we'll go over all of these tools soon so that you have a clearer idea. Lastly, we have show avatar fitting suit, which looks like a mesh that wraps around the body of the avatar, and this is a very useful tool when you have garments that you want to reuse with other avatars. As long as both the avatars have a fitting suit generated, you can redrape the clothing onto the second avatar very easily. The avatars and garments that come with Marvelous Designer already have everything set up. Using this menu here, you can switch between textured, monochrome, and wireframe views. Now we have all the environment controls here, such as the light controller to control the lighting, wind controller which is used to add wind effects while simulating clothes, show or hide the shadows, the 3D grid, and the scene statistics. And finally, this button simply shows or hides the 3D toolbar above. Let's quickly add a pre-made outfit into the scene so that we can look at more of these controls. I'm going to drag and drop this one into the scene and you'll see that it's too small. So this is where the fitting suit is going to come in handy. You can simply go up to this tool in the 3D toolbar and then select retarget draping. Now it fits perfectly. Let's simulate it by clicking here to let it properly settle onto the new avatar. You'll see that there are three options here, with a toggle to switch between the CPU and the GPU. This is a recent addition in version 2024.2, so I'm updating this part of the video. The first normal option is the default one and can be used for anything that you do in the viewport while testing out, and you still get decently realistic previews. The second one is the most accurate but also the slowest, and it makes the most sense to use this when you're done creating your garment and are running a final simulation before exporting. The third one gives you a middle ground between accuracy and speed, and this can be used when you record your simulations during animations, which we will get into in this video. Now that we have the toggle between GPU and CPU, if you have a strong enough graphics card in your system, I don't see a reason why you shouldn't be using it. It's improved now to a point that the differences between GPU and CPU simulation modes are minimal, but the difference in speed is phenomenal. Note that you can also hit the spacebar to simulate in whatever mode that is currently set here. This is basically how Marvelous Designer works. You first add an avatar, create the garment, and then simulate it and let it drape onto the avatar. Now we can take a look at all these other menus related to the garments. The first one is simply to show or hide the garments. The second one is to show or hide the seam lines between each fabric piece that is stitched together. And the third one allows us to show or hide the internal lines, the practicality of which we will get into later. But for now, you can just see the changes the toggles make. I want to go over everything that the UI has to offer before heading to the practical side of things, so that you can refer to these parts later when you're lost. The show line toggle is similar to the one for the avatar that we discussed earlier, and it is only relevant when you create something using the lines tool. The show threads toggle lets you see the relationship lines between two sewed patterns. The show pins option toggles the visibility of the pins, which is a tool that allows us to literally pin a part of the garment in space so that it is frozen when you simulate it. And this option just shows or hides it in the 3D window. The show subdivisions is another visibility toggle. You can select a part of the mesh here and subdivide it, and it will create this overlay to denote where exactly you subdivided it, and this tool simply toggles the visibility of this overlay. The show garment measurements tool is used to show or hide the measurements you take using the measurements tool here. Then we have the show garment fitting suit, which in this case would be the same as the avatar fitting suit. And lastly, we have the show topology toggle that displays the mesh you create using the topology tool. The third menu here contains view toggles for all the tertiary details you might want to add to your garments, such as buttons, pipings, meaning folded fabric along the edge of the cloth, bond or sky, which are tools for reinforcing or softening a pattern, puckering is the wrinkling of the fabric near the seams, and show all trims just toggles everything on and off. There's now a new trim window feature in Marvelous Designer where you can organize and control all of your trims in a neat categorized manner. The trims from these pre-made outfits do not show up in this new trim window, and hence they do not work with the show all trims toggle, but whatever you newly add can be viewed here and works with the show all trims toggle. Sorry for this confusion, but this feature wasn't available at the time of recording, so I didn't talk about it here, but I'll go over it in detail at a later part in the video. Just to clarify, I'm using words like pattern, garment, cloth interchangeably, and really I'm just referring to the fabric pieces that we're working with here. The fifth menu contains mesh view options for the garments. These let you toggle between textured, monochrome, wireframe, translucent, randomized color for each pattern, wireframe on surface, and thick textured, which solidifies the garment and gives us a preview of their actual thickness in 3D, which can always be modified. The next menu shows us how the garment fits the character with two overlays. The strain map indicates where the fabric has been stretched, blue means no stretching, and it transitions into red, which is the highest stretching. The show pressure points tool lets you see the areas where the fabric is in direct contact with the avatar. And that wraps up the 3D view controls. Now I quickly want to give you an overview of all the tools available in the 3D panel before going ahead to the 2D panel, which is where you're most likely to design your garments. The first tool is the Simulate tool, which we have already discussed. Next is the Move tool, which can be accessed by pressing Q, used for selecting separate patterns in the 3D view. These selections will also be reflected in the 2D view. By the way, if you ever forget the shortcut to a tool that you use frequently, you can just go to Window, Hotkey List, and you'll find the shortcuts to everything there. The third tool is also a selection tool, except that it allows us to select parts of the mesh. When you right click after making a selection, you can perform these operations on them. Next comes the Style Line tool, where you can manipulate the patterns that you have already created right inside the 3D workspace. You can edit, scale, move, and also create additional style lines inside the existing patterns. Then we have the Tag tool, which allows you to pin a portion of the garment to another part of it, or even to the avatar so that it fixes itself in that place. If you simply use the Tag tool and click on 2 points on the garment and simulate it, you'll see how they try to stretch themselves to each other and connect. You can use the Edit Tag tool to remove or change the points. The tag on avatar works similarly, but you can pin the garment to the character itself. It comes in handy when your character is moving and you want part of the garment to stick to the character regardless of the reinforcements that actually make it possible in real life. The Line Tag tool allows you to select a bunch of points instead of one. You start on the first part by clicking and then end by double clicking. Then you can go ahead and do the same on the other part and then simulate. The Line Tag on Avatar tool works the same, with double clicking to end the segment, and it is easier when you start with the garment and then move on to the avatar, because the garments become transparent and it's easier to view the avatar that way. The Reset Arrangement tools allow you to undo the simulations and reset the patterns into their default state. If you click the 2D option, it'll revert to the same positions and orientations as the 2D window. If you click on the 3D option, it'll revert to how you arranged it when you first added it in, and it might look the same as the 2D option if you only use the gizmo to position the patterns instead of offsetting using the properties or arrangement points first. This will be clearer when we add new patterns ourselves. The Fold Arrangement tool lets you fold the pattern at the seams using this new gizmo that appears. Depending on which area you click and drag, that part of the pattern will fold onto the other part along the seam, which is very useful for making collars and such. Now I want to go over this super useful feature in Marvelous Designer called the fitting suit that we briefly discussed earlier. If I have to explain it simply, you can imagine it as an invisible bodysuit that you can create for your avatars, which Marvelous Designer can later use as a reference to understand how to resize and deform the garments that you made for another avatar and drape it onto the new avatar. So let's take a new character here and create a fitting suit for it by clicking here. You'll be presented with a new project with only the avatar in it and a separate window like this. As you can see, there are labels for different joints of the character, and we need to specify them in order by drawing points on the avatar. If you think you made a mistake while adding the points, just press escape and try again. If you confirm the changes and it switched to the next joint, but you want to go back and make some changes, you can simply click on the joint that you want to reassign and draw correctly. The new loop will then replace the old one once you confirm it. At any point, you can also hit the reset button to undo everything and start fresh. Holding down shift while drawing the loop will snap it to an axis. A notable point is that sometimes the symmetry options may not work properly, or your character may be asymmetrical or not even human, and in any of those cases, you can just turn off the symmetry option here and create the loop separately for each half. Hit apply to preview the fitting suit. You can pull parts on the suit to adjust it, and once everything looks good, you can simply hit the save button and save your new avatar somewhere. If you now navigate the library panel, you should be able to see the avatar file that you just saved. This means it is successfully registered as a character in Marvelous Designer and now can be added and reused in any project, and it'll have a fitting suit associated, which you can use to retarget the draping of your already created garments. If you're importing an avatar in either the OBJ or FBX format, you get the option to auto-create a fitting suit for it, which expedites this process. Another point to note is that if you want to redrape your garment onto another character that already has a fitting suit, you need to make sure that your garment is first simulated on top of a character that already has a fitting suit. The garment will then inherit the fitting suit from that avatar and use it to calculate the draping for any new character with a fitting suit. Next are the sewing tools, which are used to sew different patterns together. This is linked to the 2D window, so I want to keep it for later when we discuss the 2D window. So moving on to the next tool, we have the topology tools, which will be a lifesaver if you want to use your garments in video games. In the 3D window, you'll see two options here, one to create the topology and one to edit it later. Using the create topology tool, you can draw on top of your patterns to create a new topology, which you can later use to remesh as a new pattern or replace the existing one by right-clicking. If you hold down Ctrl and Shift, you'll be able to draw an edge loop across the faces. Using the Edit Topology tool, you can edit the points on the topology you just created. You can also add more subdivisions, delete and merge points by distance. We'll cover it in more detail in the 2D window. Now this one is interesting. The line tool allows you to draw directly in the 3D window and then flatten them into patterns that can be simulated. If we try using the line 3D garment tool, it'll let us draw on top of the existing garments. So let's draw a little detail over here. If we hold down Shift, it'll snap to the guidelines, and holding down Ctrl while adding a point turns it into a curve. We can either double click to add the last point or close it into a loop. You can then use the edit line tool to delete points or segments, add extra points, tweak them, cut and sew them back, and also turn them into internal lines in the 2D window to perform additional operations. There's also the line avatar tool that lets you draw directly on top of the avatar, and then using the flatten tool, you can select those drawn faces and then press enter to turn them into actual patterns. You can use the edit line tool for the avatar to add or delete points, and also make sure some edges are completely straight when they're flattened. Next we have the graphics tool, which can be used to print graphics and textures on the garments and manipulate them right inside of Marvelous. The same set of tools are available in the 2D window as well, so that's where we'll be trying them out. I honestly don't find myself using this a lot since I rely on Substance Painter for my texturing process, but it is very simple and straightforward to use, as you'll see. But the next tool here, which lets you add buttons, is super cool. Let me delete the sewing between these two patterns first so that I can better showcase this to you. Let's now go and select the button tool and click wherever we want there to be buttons. The same goes for the buttonholes on the opposite side. Then we can go ahead and select the fasten buttons tool, then click on the buttons followed by the buttonholes, and then simulate it to see the result. With the fasten button tool active, you can click on a fasten button to unfasten it. With the select move button tool, you can change the positions of the buttons and buttonholes and access a bunch of other options from the right click menu. The zipper tool is just as quick. After selecting it, you can click on the edge of a pattern to add the start point and double click to end one side. Then repeat the same process on the other side. The zipper will be added and you can see what it'll look like by simulating it. You can open and close the zipper by moving the slider and simulating it again. The additional properties can be accessed in the property editor, which is this panel on the right side. Next is the piping tool, and Marvelous Designer seems to let you create the corded type of piping where a cord is placed inside the fold of the fabric, giving it a raised 3D effect. Of course, that's not actually what's happening here. It just tries to replicate that look and its effects. To use it, select the tool, select a start point and double click for the end point like any other tool. Or you could make an entire loop and click on the initial point again to complete it. Use the edit piping tool to select your pipings and get access to other tools in the right click submenu. The main properties like width can be accessed in the property editor. Next is the binding tool, which is when the fabric at the seam is rolled up and stitched on top to finish it. Piping and binding are terms that are used interchangeably, but there are differences between them that you can search online and find out more about. Or if you already know them, then that's great and you can comment down below and let everyone know. Help them out, build a constructive discussion. Anyway, the binding tool can be used in almost the same way as the piping tool, and the main properties can be accessed over at the property editor panel, whether you want it under or over the main fabric, the width, thickness, add top stitches, etc. Then there's the press tool, which lets you add ironing effects to your garments along the seam, which is prominent in formal wear. The way you use it is by selecting one pattern and then clicking the next pattern near the seam where you want there to be the neat crease. Once you've done that, then you can simulate it and see the magic happen. Next, we have our super handy measurement tools, which let you measure the lengths of your avatar or garments using different tools to create lines and circles to measure the width, circumference, height, etc. I recommend that you just play around with them so that you're able to learn them better. If you right click on the blank part of the 3D window, you can switch to different preset views, which are also mapped to different keys on the numpad. You can add your custom view in this menu and access it later as well. You can access the gizmo settings directly from here and change it to follow a different coordinate, and also increase or decrease increase its size by using the square brackets on your keyboard. You can also change the color of the background, hide or show the avatars and patterns, refresh your textures, change the viewport camera settings, simulation settings, and more using the property editor on the right side. If you right click when the simulation is running, you'll also find this new advanced pinching option in this menu. If you notice, when I pinch a part of the garment during the simulation and pull it out, it looks something like this. If we now open up the advanced pinching menu, and even with the default settings, we'll see how the pinching behaves differently, as if we're using more than 2 fingers to stretch the fabric. The menu gives you a bunch of options to change how the pinching works. The range section will let you change the shape, size, and fall off of the pinching, and this curve will give you a nice representation of the profile as you're playing around with the settings. If you notice at this part where there are 2 layers of clothing, if we grab the hoodie, the layer underneath is not affected. This can be changed by changing the distance measure in the option section from surface to straight. And now we can affect both of them at the same time. The distance indicator is this circular overlay to denote the size and fall off of the brush. The limit to selected patterns checkbox will limit the pinching to only the selected patterns, and even if there are other patterns stitched directly to it, they won't be affected. The display weight checkbox will overlay the pattern with a green color to denote the area of effect. Now let's go over the tools that we have available in the 2D window, starting with the display modes. Firstly, we have the Show 2D Sewing toggle, which indicates exactly which part is sewn to which, and the notches are there to indicate the direction. The Show Top Stitches toggle highlights all the areas with a top stitch, which looks like this in the 3D window. Then we have the Show Puckering toggle, which works similarly to the last tool, which just highlights the areas where you have applied puckering. Then we have the Show Line 3D Pattern toggle that simply toggles on and off the lines created using the Lines tool that we went over earlier. The Show Symmetric Instance Lines button toggles the visibility of these relationship lines that tell you which patterns are symmetric or instances of each other by highlighting their boundary and drawing a line between their centers. Then you'll find toggles for pattern names, lengths, grain lines, and measurements. The fourth menu is similar to the one in the 2D window, where you can just switch between textured, monochrome, translucent, transparent, and random color modes. The next tools let you lock all of the patterns in the 2D window, so you cannot select or edit them, or lock just the internal lines inside the patterns. We don't have remesh patterns in this project, so we cannot view this one, but it does exactly what it says. And finally, this button shows or hides the 2D toolbar above, which we will get into now. The first tool here is the Transform Pattern tool, accessed by pressing A on the keyboard. It simply lets you select any pattern or line or anything you create inside the 2D window and access its properties. You can hold down Shift to select multiple patterns, drag from an empty space to box select, or double click for lasso select. After selecting a pattern, you can move it by dragging, and if you hold down Shift, it'll snap to a fixed axis. And if you right click while moving it in a direction, you can specify exactly how much to displace it in that direction from its last position. Pressing Escape while moving something will cancel the operation, and it'll pop right back into its original place. You can use the dots on the dotted box that appears to scale the patterns. If you scale from any of the corner points, it'll use the opposite point as the pivot while scaling. You can double click on the center dot to activate it as the pivot point, which can be moved anywhere and also snaps to the points and edges of your pattern, even internal lines. In the same way, if you right click while scaling a pattern, a dialog box will appear where you can put in your measurements in terms of percentage or units, and you can decide whether to lock in the ratio or scale it freely in either axis. To rotate a pattern, you can use this little dot over here, which by default rotates from the center of the pattern, but you can double click on the pivot point to activate it and set it anywhere you want. Same with the other transformations, you can right click to specify how many degrees you want to rotate it by. If you need more precision, you can also right click on a pattern and head to the rotate and flip submenus, where you'll find some really handy tools. The next tool is the Edit Pattern tool, accessed by pressing Z on the keyboard. It lets you select points and edges on the pattern, including internal lines, and even the whole boundary of a pattern by double clicking on it. You can move parts of the patterns to edit them, and the same shortcuts of Shift, right click, and Escape work here too. Holding down Ctrl will let you select the edges regardless of whether or not you selected the vertices on both sides of it. After selecting a point or an edge, you can right click on it to access more tools and split it and add multiple points based on your settings, change the length of the edge and add internal lines using these two options, and also offset the pattern outline itself using specific settings. Additionally, you'll also find yourself using this unfold option quite a bit. Basically, you can select an edge that does not have any points splitting it, and then choose this unfold option to extend it by its mirror image, basically replicating it on the other side. You can always choose to unfold with sewing and symmetric editing. And then we have this new feature that was recently added called the roll up, which you can use to quickly and accurately roll up the sleeves of your trousers or shirts, for example. The only catch is that it can only affect one pattern at a time. So if you want the roll up to extend to another pattern that is sewn onto the one you applied it to, it currently isn't possible to do that. When you select two edges and right click, you also get the option to merge them. If you right click on a point, you get the options to delete it or turn it into a segment dart like this, which also automatically shows the two edges that are created. These darts are very useful for creating shaping in a garment and tailoring the perfect fit for the avatar. You can also create internal lines with reference to this point and also quickly convert it into a curve point. Try looking around in the menu that appears after right clicking, because you'll discover many useful tools like adding points to line intersections, merging two points, separating them again, extending internal lines, and then using it to cut the pattern in half and much more. Now if you check out the second tool in this menu, we have the transform point / segment tool, which is like a hybrid between the transform pattern and the edit pattern tools, because it lets you select points or edges, but it also overlays them with the marquee box to let you manipulate them easily. Next we have the edit curve point tool. The shortcut is V. Using this, you can click to add curve points on a segment and drag them to quickly add curves. While moving an existing curve point, if you do it slowly enough, it snaps to the path of the curve, and you can also make it snap to an axis by holding down Shift. With this tool selected, you can drag normal segment points and it will scale the curves accordingly, or you can hold down the D key to bypass that and only affect the segment point. You can also right click on a segment point to turn it into a curve point and vice versa. The edit curvature tool is the fastest way to add curvature to a segment. You can click and drag a segment and it will intuitively form a curve. You can adjust it later easily without having to deal with any points or handles. But if you do need that control, you can switch back to the edit pattern tool and you'll get access to the handles. To delete a curve point, you just hold Alt and click on that point, and to add it, you hold Alt and drag it away. If you hold Alt while manipulating a handle, it will be detached from its other side and you can move it freely without affecting the other handle. If you hold Control while moving it, it'll snap to its normal and follow its existing direction. And Shift, like always, will snap it to the axis. Then we have the smooth curve tool. If you click and drag on a segment point, it'll turn it into a curve like this, where you can access the specific settings by right clicking. If you click on a segment, it takes a few more steps to create the curve, but it will be exactly how you want it. So you click on the starting point, then click on the end point on another segment. Then you're asked to select which side is going to be replaced by the curve, which is this side in this case, so I'll click here. Then if I take this reference line that was created and drag it down, you'll see that I've created the exact curve I wanted and the two segments have been replaced by it. And then you can really fine tune it by using the handles in the edit pattern tool. If you use this tool on an already existing curve, you can change its curvature from the middle. If your curve has multiple curve points, they'll be replaced. Also, if you drag the tool to its maximum extent, it'll convert the curve into two straight lines and create a segment point instead. Let's check out the add point split line tool now, shortcut to which is X. With this tool active, if you hover over a segment, you'll see that a point appears to show where it can be added. If you right click, you'll see the split line menu where line 1 is the shorter side highlighted in yellow and line 2 is the longer or blue side. The line can either be split by ratios into two lines or multiple segments using the other two methods. While hovering over the line, it'll also snap to existing points if you have Smart Guide turned on. Simply left click to add the point at your desired location. You can also select multiple segments and then split them as if they are a single line. The slash and spread tool simplifies the process of creating folds and pleats, useful for making garments such as skirts. Let's take this rectangle here, and with the tool active, I'll click where I want the cut to pivot from basically. So let's click here, and then wherever you click next will complete the line. Now we have to select which side we want to rotate and extend, and in this case we'll pick this side. And here you can see how it pivots around the first point that we specified. You can right click to input exact values, so let's go for 45 degrees and hit OK. You'll see that the side that we rotated is intact with the same size and the gap has been filled accurately with this arc, and the shape would have been pretty difficult to create otherwise. The trace tool, accessed by eye, is a really handy tool that lets you select multiple segments and trace their enclosed regions one-to-one as patterns and internal shapes. If there are internal lines in the enclosed region, they'll be traced even if you don't select them. It's a simple tool, but it comes in really handy. The create pattern tool group here lets us create patterns from scratch using different primitive shapes such as rectangles, ellipses, freeform polygons, and even spirals. Let's start with the rectangle tool. The shortcut is S. Just click and drag to create a freeform rectangle. If you hold down Shift, it creates a square. If you hold down Control, it considers the point that you started from as the center and scales it from there. If you only left click at a point, it'll bring up a menu where you can type in your exact measurements and create multiple of them at the same time with specific angles and distances between them. The ellipse tool with the shortcut of E works in the same way with all of the hotkeys. The polygon tool lets you create points and freely draw a polygon. Holding down Shift snaps it to the axis, and Control lets you add curve points, or you can also drag your mouse away without releasing the left click while adding a new point to create them. If you wish to undo a step, you want to press the delete or backspace key, because pressing escape or Ctrl Z will undo the whole operation. You can also right click to specify the length of your new line and if and how you want to mirror it. Continue the shape back to the first point you added to finish the operation and get the pattern. The spiral tool is a special one. You can left click and drag in the 2D window to start, or just simply left click. Either way, most of your tweaking will be done inside this pop-up menu. The radius defines the length from the center to the start of the spiral, and the offset is the length from the first spiral to the second, and so on. If these two values are the same, you'll get a uniform spiral. The inner and outer length will define how many turns are created, and the side values determine the width of the pattern. And the cool thing is that you can specify two different values here and it'll automatically taper it out. The direction lets you specify whether the spiral will turn clockwise or anti-clockwise. Hit OK and there you have your spiral pattern. Next we have the internal shape tool group. You'll see that the first three tools are pretty much the same as the create pattern tools, and their hotkeys for snapping and stuff are the same as well. But you'll see this dart tool is different. Darts in the real world are used for shaping garments, and Marvelous Designer mimics it as well. You can add in a dart by simply clicking and dragging and letting go, or left clicking to bring up the pop-up menu for the specific measurements. With the transform pattern tool, you can also select, copy paste, or delete them just like any other pattern or internal shape. What's cool is that when you create a dart, you'll see this hole in the pattern, but it automatically stitches the two sides as well and saves you a few extra steps. The auto fitting tool works similarly to the retarget draping tool in the 3D window, with a few extra settings like maintaining the pattern curvature, graphic size, and texture size. Let's talk about the sewing tools now. These are tools that allow you to sew edges of different patterns so that they attach when you simulate them. If you grab a pattern piece in the 3D window and drag it away, you'll see all these lines that show you exactly which part is sewn onto where, with different colors for easier identification. You can also visualize this in the 2D window by turning on the Show 2D Sewing option here, or you can just switch to the Edit Sewing tool to temporarily activate it. When you hover over the edges, it'll show you these dotted lines to indicate the sewing relationship between the patterns. These notches that you see on the sewn edges tell you the direction of the stitching, which will be clearer when we use the tools. So let's start fresh with two basic square patterns to test out these tools on. The first tool is the segment sewing tool, which simply sews one edge to another. When you hover over an edge, you'll see this notch here, and whatever direction this is placed in is how you'd want the other side to be as well. And once you finish the sewing, you'll see these parallel lines going across the edges. If you simulate this, you'll see that it works as expected. However, if these notches are not aligned, you'll see that these lines are intersecting each other to indicate that the top part of this edge is sewn onto the bottom of this edge, which in most cases wouldn't be what you want. And if you simulate this, it'll turn into a mess. To fix this, we can use the Edit Sewing tool and just right click on one of the edges and reverse the sewing, or just delete it and start over. The next tool is the MN Sewing tool, which lets you sew a group of edges to another group of edges, and hence the name. It works in a similar way to the previous tool, except you can select multiple edges on one side, hit enter, and then select the edges on the second group and then hit enter again. And this will create the sewing relationship. And even though these edges are of different lengths that add up to the same length, it'll work perfectly. The next tool is the Free Sewing tool, where you can freely define the part of the edge to be sewn. So you click to start, and wherever you click next will define your selection for this side, and then you can move on by clicking to start again for this side, and you'll see this as you're dragging that a new point appears that matches the length of the first side. So we can take the help of this to exactly recreate what the MN Sewing tool did. You can also sew edges of different lengths, but then the longer side will create a bit of gathering. Finally, we have the MN Free Sewing, which is basically the MN version of the Free Sewing tool. So you can freely define one side of the sewing, hit enter, and then define the other side and hit enter again, just like the MN Segment Sewing tool, and it'll create the exact same results. But now I can also do something like this, where I end a selection short or leave gaps in between selections, and basically I'm not limited to select the entire edge of the pattern and have the freedom to only select parts of it. And if you're curious about this last tool right here, this just asks you for length or ratio difference value and highlights all the sewing relationships that match this value. Any value above 0 will show you wherever there's gathering of fabric, but it's not really noticeable when the difference in length between the edges is very small. So let's say we instead put in a value like 50mm. It'll highlight these parts near the waist and calves in this case where there is actually notable gathering. Next we have the topology tools, and I want to start off with the patch topology tool first. When you click on it, you'll get this dialog box where it asks for the number of subdivisions. If you click on your pattern and drag, you'll see this line with the specified number of subdivisions, and you can change this number even after you've already started creating it, and it'll update live. What I like to do is divide the mesh into simpler parts and then use the patch tool to create a basic topology for each part separately. So let's start with the bottom part of the t-shirt since it's basically a rectangle. For this next part, let's increase the number of subdivisions and complete it. You can also click on an edge after you're finished and still change the number of subdivisions, and it'll update the topology accordingly. Once you're happy with how it looks, you can click on create and it'll finalize it. Now if you go to the edit topology tool, you can double click on any edge to see its edge loop. You'll notice that the edge loops are all over the place in this topology, but it's simply an example, and if you use this tool intently, you can get some great results. Now if you check in the 3D window, the topology we have created correctly conforms to the deformations we already have simulated, which is exactly what we wanted. Using the Edit Topology tool, you can select vertices, edges, and faces and move them around. Double-clicking on a vertex will select all of them, and double-clicking on an edge selects its loop. If you right-click on your topology, you get the options to delete parts of it, merge multiple vertices, merge them by distance to clean it up, subdivide the entire topology, and convert this topology into a pattern to finalize things. And this can be done either by replacing the existing pattern or keeping it and just duplicating this topology as a new pattern. Then we have the Create Topology tool, which is where you manually create your topology vertex by vertex. But this allows for much greater control over how your edge loops flow, which is really important, and you can add loop cuts by holding down Control and Shift and then left clicking to cut it exactly where you want it. Then you can go to the Edit Topology tool and add more subdivisions to refine it further. An interesting tool is the Steam tool here, and using this you can specify a shrinkage value, and it mimics the way that a steam iron would work in the real world, but in an exaggerated form. So using a negative value, you can paint on parts of your pattern, and if you simulate them, you'll see the effect. If you use a positive value, it will expand. The other two settings are for adjusting the brush size and fall off. You can imagine how quickly you can get specific shapes and folds using this tool without having to create complex patterns. Next we have the seam taping tool, which is used for reinforcing the seams of the garment to prevent stretching or too many deformations. I'll use this extreme example of a t-shirt blowing in the wind to show how this can be effective. You can see how the sleeves are getting all deformed by the wind, but if we simply select this tool and then select the edges of our sleeves, it'll apply seam taping to it, and now if you check, the deformations are drastically reduced. This can be applied to cuffs, collars, and shoulder stitches to reinforce them. You can use the property editor to change the material used for the taping and the width of the taping. Next, we have tools for adding and manipulating textures and graphics. If you select the Edit Texture tool, you'll see this new icon on the top right corner. You can then select a pattern with a textured fabric and then use this new gizmo to scale and rotate the textures of that fabric overall. If you use the gizmo that you see on top of the selected pattern, you can change the texture's position. You might have already noticed these arrows on every pattern piece, and these indicate the grain direction. So when you select a pattern and use this gizmo to rotate, it changes the direction of your grain, which means it doesn't only affect the texture rotation, but also the way Marvelous will treat the knitting of the fabric, the weft and the warp directions, and when you need to actually apply some of those effects that we'll talk about later, it'll reference this new direction that you set, and that may not be desirable depending on what you want. You can also right click on a pattern to reset the grain to the Y or X axis and flip the textures around, etc. The next tool is the Transform Graphic tool, which lets you select, move, rotate, and scale your existing graphics inside your patterns, and you can hold down Shift to snap it to the axis. While dragging, you can right click to enter the specifics, and if you right click on any selected graphic, you get the options to delete, copy, paste, duplicate to the symmetric pattern that you might already have, set the layering if you have multiple graphics, rotate in increments, tile it, which is really helpful in some cases, flip it around and reset it to the original size. And using this next tool, you can add in new graphics. Simply choose the graphics you want to add, click on the pattern that you want to add it to, set up exactly how you want to add it, and hit OK. Then you can use the Transform Graphic tool to do whatever. For this next tool, I'm going to use this basic skirt pattern to demonstrate it better. This tool is used to add pleats to your garments very quickly. But before we do that, we need a bunch of internal lines in our pattern that it can use to basically fold in and out, depending upon the type of pleat we choose, to create our desired effect. A quick way to add internal lines to an existing pattern is to select the opposite edges, right-click and select Offset as internal line along curved, and then just specify the number of edges you want and they'll all be equidistant. Now we can actually go ahead and use the Pleats Fold tool. First we need to specify the direction of the pleats, so let's click on one side of the patterns and then double click on the other side. This new menu appears where you can select the type of pleats you want, reverse the direction of the folds if you're aiming for a specific look, specify the number of internal lines it uses to create the pleats, and specify the angles of the folds. The shorter the range of these two angles, the weaker the pleats are going to be, so I prefer to keep it at 0 to 360. Let's go for knife pleats first and hit OK. Now if you simulate, you'll see how amazing this tool is. 10 out of 10 pleats, super easy. If we view them from the bottom, you can see the shape each type of pleat creates. So if we change this to box pleats, let's say, this is what it looks like. And the accordion pleats are simply just this alternating in and out folds pattern that is very common in a lot of skirts. The next tool is the pleat sewing tool, and you may wonder what's the difference between using this versus the segment sewing tool that we already have on the skirt to sew the pleats to the waistband. The thing is, pleats in real life aren't just sewn to the waistband, but the folds are also stitched to one another. This will be apparent when you take a closer look at the pleats near the waistband currently and compare them to an actual skirt. To fix this, let's first delete the segment sewing that we have on this. I'm going to turn off gravity and freeze the waistband and simulate it so that the pleats open up a bit. Now let's select this tool, select half of the waistband and then select the first half of the pleats, and oops, we can't seem to select only the top edge. It's because the internal lines aren't actually connected to the edge and creating those segment points that we need to define each pleat, so to speak. So let's press Z and select Extend to Pattern Outline. Now if you try again, we can actually sew these two parts easily. Finish it up and simulate it with gravity turned on, and it's looking much better than what we had before. Of course, if you create the initial patterns and the number of internal lines more precisely, you can get rid of these weird edges and have a smooth, continuous flow of pleats. Next tool is for top stitches, which is used for stitching that is visible on top of the garment and can be great for adding visual detail on your digital garments. The first tool is the Edit Top Stitch tool, used for manipulating existing top stitches. If you select a top stitch, you can change its settings in the property editor. You can also open up the top stitch window to get access to all the types of top stitches used in your garments and get complete control over how it looks, such as whether you want to display it as an actual 3D object or a baked-in texture, the shape and fabric, etc. Then we have these tools to create the top stitching, and the naming convention might feel familiar to you already. The Segment Top Stitch tool allows you to select any segment or internal line to add top stitching to it, and it works like you'd expect. You can change basic settings after adding it, like whether you want to extend the start or end of the top stitch so that they don't end at right angles and instead flow into the actual edge of the pattern. For the next set of parameters, like for example changing how the corner looks when we have two top stitches like so, we can't actually use the Segment Top Stitch tool for it. This is where the Free Top Stitch tool comes into use, where you can create a continuous top stitch along multiple segments and then get access to these parameters and get the exact look you want. The Seam Lines Top Stitch tool, as the name suggests, is used specifically for the segments that are sewn together. You'll notice when you use it, it adds stitching to both the patterns with a little bit of offset from the actual edge, which looks more practical. You can also add any number of stitches using the Segment Top Stitch tool as well, just by selecting the top stitch type in the top stitch window and going down to where it says number of lines and then increase that value to whatever you want. The next set of tools are a very recent addition to Marvelous Designer, and these are for adding puckering effects to your garments without actually affecting the 3D shape. It works by adding the effects to the normal map of the material instead. If you hover over it, you can see that the options are very similar to the top stitching tools. The Segment Puckering tool lets you apply it to one segment at a time, and you cannot add multiple puckerings on top of each other. The Free Puckering tool lets you freely define the area where you want this effect, starting with a click and ending with a click as well. And then we have the Seam Line Puckering tool, which adds it to both the edges where there's a sewing relationship. Then you can use the Edit Puckering tool to manipulate your created puckerings, delete them, change their properties similar to the top stitches. Speaking of which, it's actually a really good idea to add some puckering near the top stitches to give it that extra detail and fine-tune the placement using the offset value. Similar to the top stitch window, there's a puckering window as well, where you can go in and change the look as well as the intensity of the puckering and add different variations of it to really fit your garments the best. Now this last tool here is going to look a bit confusing. If you open it, it's empty and it probably isn't making much sense. The thing is, Marvelous Designer has this really cool feature where where you're provided with a bunch of these basic building blocks for creating garments, and you can piece them together to create any kind of basic garment you want as a starting point for your designs. Let's take a proper look at it. Switch this library window to the modular configurator window, and you're presented with these 3 folders here labeled man, woman, and folded shirt, because that's obviously the third gender. Anyway, let's check out the women's folder since we're working with a female character here, and I think I want to give her a jacket. Now it gets interesting because you can double click on one of these options and it'll give you some basic options to choose from for the front, back, and the sleeves of the jacket. Double click to import it in just like that, simulate it, and you've got yourself a jacket. You can probably already tell how powerful this is for speeding up your workflow. To get back on topic, the modular editor we encountered in the 2D window got updated with these blocks too, and whichever block you click on here will be activated in the simulation and the rest will be deactivated. And clicking on it again will activate all of them back. This little folder icon on the top right corner of the blocks lets you switch it out for another one, or you can just do it from here. Now let's say you make some changes to the garment inside these blocks, which also have symmetry enabled by the way, so this makes it super easy. You'll see that the icon in the modular editor has been updated, and clicking on this other icon here, you can actually save it out as a template and use it in the future. So in that way, you get the option to create your own blocks too. Another thing to note here is that the default collection of blocks works best when the character is in the attention pose, which you can find in the library. Of course, you can go ahead and use another pose as well, and then just adjust the sleeves or any mismatched patterns manually, but then it kind of defeats the purpose of the modular configurator in my opinion. And once you build out your garments in this attention pose, you can always have the character transition into any other pose with relative ease anyway, which we will also be covering later in this video. Anyway, this brings an end to the 2D toolbar. If you right click in the blank space of the 2D window, you get this menu. First, you have the options to paste or mirror paste whatever you have copied. These 3 options are also available in the toolbar that we discussed earlier. Then you have the options to refresh the textures, delete overlapping points, remove modular relationship from the blocks, optimize curve points to remove redundant points in between, remove the effects of the steam tool, a toggle for smart guide that snaps your elements to different kinds of guides, and I recommend that you have it turned on for most cases. Snap to pattern snaps the vertices of the pattern you're moving to the vertices of nearby patterns. Snap to grid makes the patterns and internal shapes snap to the grid, the size of which can be changed from the preferences tab or the right click menu. The zoom extends all sets the view to make all the patterns visible at once, no matter if you were zoomed in or out or panned way off somewhere. You can also add background images using this option. It brings up a menu where you can select your image file, set the scale, rotation, and opacity with a neat toggle to show or hide the patterns for references. Once you've added it, you can always go back and edit it too. Let's zoom out and take a breather now and see what more we have overall in the UI. You'll notice that the top shelf of tabs here contain mostly the same tools as the ones we just discussed. Let's go to the window tab and see if we missed anything. The property editor is this window on the right, which is purely contextual and changes based on whatever object you currently have selected, so it's pointless to theorize it. Instead of checking the Windows tab here, let's just change the fabric window to whatever we want. The history tab keeps track of your actions in the current session, and at any point you can jump directly to a specific action, basically acting as the undo redo button on steroids. The scene browser window contains all of the objects in your project in a neatly organized structure, so you can expand and collapse different types of objects and get access to them directly from here. The fabric, button, buttonholes, top stitch, and puckering windows all allow you to have different variations of them and assign them to different parts of your garment. For example, you can have one pattern be a cotton fabric and another be silk. It's already in action with a lot of the preset garments and in very creative ways too. For example, in this dress, the shoulder strap is intentionally bigger to avoid simulation issues, but all this extra part is assigned a different fabric, which we can turn completely transparent, and it'll seem like the shoulder strap is very thin. And with this technique, you can go as thin as you want without any artifacts. The sculpt window is interesting. Let's switch the 2D window to it so that we get a better view. This is where you can literally sculpt details onto your simulated garments without having to export it into a sculpting software like ZBrush. It's definitely not as feature packed, but for anything fabric related, it'll get the job done just fine. The navigation controls are same as in the 3D window, but make sure you keep your cursor in an empty space when moving around, or you could accidentally activate a tool instead. Now we have a few different tools here to work with, starting with the wrinkle brush. In the property editor, you can change the settings for the brush, such as the simulation preset, and basically how sculpting in Marvelous Designer works is by running a lightweight simulation inside the brush area to get realistic deformations, and changing this right here is similar to changing the simulation mode right here. You'll get the option to change the size of the brush, the fall off using this focal slider, and this realistic slider, from what I've noticed, changes the severity of the wrinkles and seems to adhere to actual fabric properties more. If your garment has layers, setting this value to the number of layers you have in your garment can actually help with the collision issues, since it will then simulate all the 3 layered patterns together and create the wrinkles. The entire material section is just to change how it looks in the viewport. Now by default, the backside of the mesh is occluded or invisible, but checking this double-sided box here makes it opaque. This release brush here actually undoes your wrinkles, which is different from the smooth brush in the sense that instead of smearing it out, it loosens the wrinkles a bit in a more realistic way, and you can also get it to look like the fabric is folding down. The sculpt brush simply lets you draw, and checking this inverted option will let you push in wherever you draw instead of pulling those parts out. You can also use any kind of alpha image here as the brush, like any other sculpting package. Then we have the grab brush, which just grabs whatever you tap on depending on the size and fall off and lets you move it around. Now the stamp brush is where it gets really useful. You can choose a black and white image of a wrinkle here and then click somewhere and drag it out to stamp that wrinkle exactly the way you want it. If you don't choose anything here, it'll just make a blob, but yeah, you want to use it with an image. Then finally we have the pinch brush that brings surrounding areas closer to the middle, allowing you to define wrinkles and make them sharper. So that's the sculpting window in a nutshell. Ideally you want to use it to add more details after you simulated everything and are about to export it out. Next comes the UV editor. The view modes available here are to switch between all the types of texture maps from base color, roughness, normals, etc. The navigation controls here are the same as the 2D window. You can move the islands around by left clicking and dragging, giving you a yellow outline of the pattern as a preview. Right clicking on it will give you the option to flip it horizontally or vertically and fit it to the 0 to 1 space, with the size offset being defined either by exact measurement in millimeters or relative to the 0 to 1 space. Right clicking on a blank space will bring up a different menu where you can reset the UV arrangement to match the 2D arrangement and fit all of it into the 0 to 1 space without changing any of the transformations. And this was all you had until recently, when they added more tools to make handling UVs a lot more convenient for us. And these tools can be found on the top toolbar. So let's first select the islands for the jacket, head to the UV packing tool here, and this will bring up a menu. Let's apply it with the default settings and see how it looks. And you can see that it's already doing a much better job than the older tools, but let's take a look at the settings to really get a grasp of it. The padding value defines the space between each island, so if you increase it and then hit apply, the islands will be more spaced apart from each other. The fidelity slider can be thought of as the accuracy of the packing algorithm, in the sense that lower values really simplify the shapes of the islands while calculating how to pack them, and higher values don't simplify it as much, leading to more accurate packing. The fixed scale ratio checkbox will ensure that the ratio of the size of the smaller pieces to the larger pieces stays the same, and it ensures that the textile density isn't messed up. The rotation checkbox permits Marvelous to rotate your islands to get the most efficient packing. Then there's the advanced placement checkbox. When this is turned off, the algorithm picks the largest island first and then places it, and then goes to the second largest, places it, and then continues with the rest like that. This is very fast, but it may not always be the most accurate or efficient way to pack the islands. When you turn this checkbox on, it tests out different sequences instead of just sticking with the largest to smallest, thus ensuring the most efficient packing with the least wasted space. And that's exactly what we want when working with UVs. This does slow down the process a bit, but I have yet to encounter a situation where it was disruptive, so I'd recommend that you keep it turned on for most cases. Let's use this tool on the brow now with the same settings, but change the UV area to selected tile and set the U value to 2 and V to 1, which is this tile right here, and it'll give you a preview by highlighting the border of that tile in white. And finally, do the same for the pants, and now we have a much cleaner and efficient UV map. Now let's say I want to move all these islands to be packed inside this tile here without repacking it. I could drag them here and manually place them, but a faster and more accurate way to do this is by using the Move UV tool. Simply type in the distance field the number of tiles you want to move across, and then you can tap on these arrows to move everything very easily. The Bake Textures tool allows you to export all of your texture maps. If you like to do the texturing process in a different software like Substance Painter, then you might not necessarily need to export your textures. But let's say you have your top stitches and whatnot as textures and not 3D objects, then all of that stuff is going to be baked into the texture maps. Anyway, it's a simple process, defining the resolution of your maps, the tiles you want to export, the types of maps you want to export, and hit save. If you're using UDIMs like we are here, meaning if your UV map is comprised of multiple tiles and not bounded to the 0 to 1 tile, then the naming of the images will get the suffix as per the UDIM tiles naming convention and will be recognized by Blender or any other software. Then there's the UV snapshot tool that exports the UV layouts so that you can bring them into, let's say, Photoshop and create your textures accordingly. They are transparent images with only the wireframe having color, which you can change in the pop-up menu. Next window is the hotkey list window, which I've already mentioned briefly before. It's simply a list that shows you all the hotkeys assigned to different important tools and operations. The next two windows of the USD layer and Omniverse Connected are related to the importing, exporting, and creating links between different software, and we'll cover that soon when we talk about the software interoperability options in Marvelous Designer. We've been ignoring the animation editor for far too long now, and that's what we'll cover next. You can click on this arrow button at the bottom to expand the animation editor. Let's first add an animation to our character so that we can better interact with the animation editor. The preset animation are found inside the motion folder. You can either double click or drag and drop and it'll bring up the same menu. The first checkbox changes the position of your garments and avatar so that they're exactly where the animation starts in order to keep them in sync. And the transition animation checkbox offsets the start of the animation by whatever number of frames you set here and keyframes the current pose of the avatar so that it smoothly transitions from the current pose to the animation that you just added. You'll see why this is really important very soon. Now we can see that two layers were added in the animation editor, one for the motion that we just added and one for the transition animation. These dashes that you see here are the keyframes, and comparatively you can see that the transition animation has just two keyframes, one at the start and one at the end, which is the A pose and the starting pose right here. The controls here for the animation editor are similar to any other software. There's a play button, these two buttons to jump one frame backwards or forwards, and these two for jumping to the start or the end of the animation timeline. We can't really see the end of the timeline since it's restricted to 300, but our animation is around 740 frames long. If you click here on this fit horizontal button, it'll add both the start and end values here to match the length of the animation, which can be manipulated from the panel on the right. Playing back the animation, you'll see that the playback is super fast right now, and that's because it's set to frame stepping by default. Change it to real time to play it back at the normal speed. You can skew the entire animation by changing this scene time warp value. One is the actual speed, anything lower will speed it up, and anything higher will slow it down. If you only wish to change the playback speed, it can be done through this multiplier button. If you right click on a layer, you get the options to rename or delete them. Time slider setting option just brings up a menu with all the settings you can already access from the quick menu on the right, and it affects the entire timeline and not just this layer. You can give your layers different colors, lock them so that they cannot be deleted or edited in any way, and hide the visibility of their keyframes so that it just shows a filled bar and not the notches. To zoom into the timeline, you can simply use your scroll wheel, and same for panning. Or you can just use the slider below to navigate. Hovering over a keyframe highlights it in white, and clicking on it turns it yellow. You can select multiple of them by holding down Shift, or select a range by holding down Shift and then clicking and dragging. These handles can be modified even after you release the Shift key, and it displays the exact frame numbers. Double-clicking on the layer will select everything, and then you can move it horizontally. Before we continue further, let's first record the animations of the garment to fit the character's animation by clicking on this record button here. That's where the transition animation comes in. The general workflow is that we create the garments in the neutral pose, like the A pose, and then let the garments deform into the starting pose of the animation. This way, we don't have to create the garments in weird, complicated shapes and just hope it simulates okay and looks fine. The transition animation needs to be long enough so that the deformations can happen in a controlled way, because if it's too short, it means that the movements are going to be too sudden and it'll cause issues with the simulation. Once you record the simulation, you'll see this new layer added for the garments animations, and it adds a keyframe on all the frames. Before recording, you can also set the simulation quality. We have already recorded it at the default quality, but let's now switch it to animation stable and see the difference. Let's turn off this layer now and check the old version. You can see how the skirt is bouncing in a weird way, and when the hand touches the skirt, it creates some low quality deformations. Now if you turn the new layer on and check it out, you can see that the bouncing is gone, the fabric feels heavier and more true to life, and when the hand touches the skirt, it gives us a more predictable result, and overall the entire animation feels much more stable. That's why we'll always try to use the animation quality while, well, recording animations. Anyway, if you turn both the layers on, you'll see that it makes no difference than just turning the topmost layer on. This is because it prioritizes whatever is on top and overrides the bottom layer. Now let's say I want the bottom layer from this part onwards and not the top layer. In that case, I would just cut this animation layer right here and it'll split it into two layers at this point. Then I can delete the layer I don't need. Then we can select these two layers, right click here and select merge to turn it into a single layer. However, if we scrub through this part, we can see that the transition between these two layers is super abrupt. There's one simple way to mitigate this without having to re-record everything. Since this is all keyframes, we can select a range from the point where it is abrupt to a few frames forward and then delete them. Then these two keyframes will be interpolated linearly. If you play through now, we'll see that the garments are going through the mesh. Let's start with a central point between these two keyframes and simulate this part again. Then we can click this button to add a keyframe right here for what we just simulated in the 3D viewport. If it still isn't fixed, you can scrub through it again and find the messed up parts, simulate and add the keyframes again. Finally, we'll have something like this where the animation transitions really smoothly. But yeah, this probably isn't the best example in the world because the position of our waistband was different in both the layers, so the skirt is sort of rising up like this, making it look weird. So let's take a look from one of my personal projects as another example. So here's the project. It's a 13-second loop of this character swinging in a rainy grassland under a tree, and you'll see right here that the loop is pretty much seamless. The trick is to have the first keyframe the same as the last keyframe and deleting a few keyframes towards the end so that there's enough time for the deformations to interpolate into the end keyframe, which is just a copy of the first keyframe. That must sound confusing, so let's record this animation again and see how we can recreate it. The first step is to copy the first keyframe and then go to the end of the animation and paste it on top of the last keyframe to replace it. Now if you check the start and end of the timeline, it should look the same. Now let's go back a few frames to where the swing is paused for a second before going forward and delete this range of keyframes. Now it will interpolate smoothly, but it almost looks too robotic, so we're gonna add one or two keyframes in between to break it up, and with this technique you can easily create any kind of loop you want. Now going back to the main project, let's take a look at some more settings. You'll notice when you switch the simulation quality to any other mode, you get a list of settings in the property editor. These simulation settings can also be accessed by right-clicking the 3D viewport and then selecting simulation properties. Firstly, we have these 4 presets to choose from, and don't worry about this thing on top. If you press open here, it just opens the same presets and you can create your own basically. But for most cases, I think you'll be fine just using one of these presets. The normal default preset is ideal for most workflows as it delivers a balance between performance and precision. If you're working on an animation, the animation stable preset prioritizes stability, ensuring consistent high quality cloth behavior over multiple frames. For those looking for the most realistic fabric interactions, the fitting accurate fabric preset strictly adheres to physical properties but comes at the cost of speed. You can also create a custom preset by manually adjusting the settings. So let's switch to animation stable and take a look at what each setting does. Time step. The time step value determines how frequently the simulation updates and is directly tied to the frame rate of your project. For instance, a time step of 0.3 repeating corresponds to 1/30th of a second, making it suitable for a 30 FPS project. This is because the simulation updates once per frame, ensuring smooth and consistent motion. A good rule of thumb is to calculate the time step by dividing 1 by your project's FPS to maintain realistic movement. However, this rule can be adjusted if necessary. Using a smaller time step such as 0.01 increases precision by reducing the jitter and artifacts, making it ideal for high detail simulations, though it does require more processing power. On the other hand, a larger time step like 0.1 or higher speeds up the simulation at the cost of accuracy, which can be useful for quick previews when computational power is a limitation. Ultimately, the best time step depends on your needs. If stability and realism are a priority, sticking to the FPS-based calculation is recommended. If performance is a concern, increasing the time step can help speed up the simulation, but just be mindful of potential inaccuracies in fabric behavior. The simulation quality affects how detailed the fabric folds and movements appear. It ranges from 1 to 50, with higher values producing more refined, natural behavior at the cost of performance. For most projects, a setting between 4 and 5 is recommended, while 6 to 10 can be used for final renders. Now the CG in the next three settings stands for conjugate gradient, and it is basically an algorithm that is responsible for computing fabric movement efficiently. So the first is CG finish condition. This setting determines how long the solver will refine the fabric's deformations before stopping. You can choose iteration, where the solver runs for a set number of cycles, or residual, where it continues until the error is below a certain threshold. CG iteration count. A higher iteration count improves the accuracy by allowing more refinements per simulation step. A default setting of 20 to 50 is balanced for most cases, but increasing it to 80 to 100 provides smoother results at the cost of speed. CG residual. The residual value controls how precise the solver needs to be before stopping. A lower value results in more accurate cloth simulation but increases the computation time. The default value here is balanced, while anything lower is only needed for extreme precision. The self-collision iteration count setting controls how frequently the cloth checks for self-intersection. A default value of 1 to 3 is fine for most garments, but for multi-layered clothing, increasing this to 5 or more can help prevent penetration issues. Air damping simulates how much resistance the fabric experiences from the surrounding air. Higher values result in greater resistance, causing the fabric to settle more quickly and reducing excessive movement, while lower values allow for more dynamic motion. Next is gravity, which determines how the fabric falls and behaves in the simulation. The default setting of -9,800 represents Earth's gravity at 9.8 meter per second square. Lowering this value to -5,000 creates a lower gravity effect, making the fabric behave as if it's on the moon. The number of CPU in use setting dictates how many CPU cores are allocated to the simulation. Using more cores will definitely speed up the simulation, but performance gains depend on your system's capabilities. Non-linear simulation. Non-linear simulation accounts for fabric behaviors that are not directly proportional to the applied forces, such as bending, wrinkling, and elastic deformations. When enabled, this setting ensures that the fabric folds and deforms more naturally, particularly for complex garments. However, it can significantly increase computation time, so it's best used when high realism is required. The next few settings are for collision detection. Under the ground category, we have the collision option, which allows garments to collide with the ground, preventing the cloth from falling through the scene. You can also adjust the ground height to fine-tune how garments interact with the surface. Under avatar cloth collision detection, the triangle vertex option ensures that the cloth conforms correctly to the avatar's geometry, preventing unwanted penetration. Self-collision detection ensures that different parts of the garment don't pass through each other. The triangle vertex setting prevents fabric from intersecting itself, while the edge-to-edge option improves how thin edges behave. Adjusting the avoidance stiffness can help strengthen these interactions, reducing clipping issues but making the fabric slightly stiffer. Proximity detection ensures that garments respond realistically when they come close to other objects or layers. The vertex triangle checkbox detects when cloth vertices approach other surfaces to prevent unwanted interactions. Edge-to-edge ensures the edges of the garments interact correctly, avoiding unnatural overlaps. Next, the intersection resolution checkbox helps refine how the simulation resolves collisions between overlapping fabric parts. And finally, the layer-based collision detection ensures that multiple layers of garments interact properly without merging into each other, taking into account the layer value of the pattern. That wraps up the simulation properties. You'll find yourself using the presets for most cases, but it's good to know what each setting really does to optimize it for bigger projects. Finally, one last thing I want to talk about in the animation editor is the new video capture feature. It's a pretty simple tool. It just captures whatever you have in your 3D window and renders it out into a video format. Basically really good for previewing when your viewport performance isn't that great and you want to get a good idea of what the final animation would look like. Just press on this button, set the basic settings like resolution, format, and saving path, and all the other stuff like frame range and FPS are going to be derived from your animation settings. Hit this capture button to start rendering. You can even move around the camera while it's rendering and get some basic camera motion in there. Once it finishes rendering, it'll automatically launch your default video player to show you the final result. Note that if you had looping turned on before rendering, it'll render the loop again and again until you press the stop button. So yeah, very basic tool. It's a very recent addition too during the time of recording this video, and I'm guessing it'll be improved with additional functionality in the future. But it's definitely nice to have this as a preview feature at least. The next thing that I want to talk about that kind of ties into the animation side of things as well are the environment controllers. We briefly went over them while discussing the 3D view tools, so let's go over them properly now. The first type is the light controller, and by default there are 2 lights in the project, which we can see if we turn on the toggle. Let's also bring up the scene browser menu and expand the environment category, and there you can see that there are 2 lights in the scene. The first type of lighting is the environment light, which lights up the entire scene uniformly and gives you the option to change the light intensity and the light angle. It doesn't matter where you put it in the scene, it's gonna do its thing the same. The second type of lighting is the directional light. The only property you can change here is the color. This acts differently in the default mode and the quality render mode. In the default mode, the position of the light doesn't really matter and it's mostly controllable by the rotation. But it does seem to have sort of a clipping distance thing going on, where you get full lighting when it's pretty close to the character and clips off the lighting after a certain distance. If you move it too far away from the character, it gives you the same effect as being too close to the character and the shadow on the ground disappears. In the quality render mode, the distance artifact doesn't happen, but then it just acts like a point light and the rotation doesn't seem to have any effect. All in all, these light controllers are just there for previewing purposes. Marvelous has never claimed or prioritized rendering capabilities in any way, and that's absolutely fine. The next controller is very important though, since it has a direct effect on how the garments look. It's the wind controller, and as the name suggests, it's used to add wind effects to our garments. To start, select the wind controller, head to the property editor and click on activate. Simulating the viewport and you'll see that our skirt goes flying off. Let's select the controller and press F to focus on it, and you'll see that there's a blue line going out of it that indicates the direction of the wind. We can use the gizmo to rotate the controller and change the direction of the wind. If you try changing the position, you'll see no significant changes. That's because the unlimited bounce checkbox is turned on by default, which extends it infinitely. If we turn it off, we'll see some extra overlays on the controller that indicate its bounce or the area of effect. If you simulate it now, it's obvious that the clothes won't be affected since none of it is inside the bounce right now. So let's select the controller, click on this little gray box here that will change the gizmo to let us scale the controller. Scale and position it in a way that only a part of the skirt touches the overlay. Then if we try simulating it, you'll see that only the parts inside the overlay are affected by the wind. Let's switch it back to unlimited bounce so that we can discuss the other settings. The first setting is the type, and you can choose between planar and spherical. Planar blows the wind in a certain direction, and spherical blows it in all the directions equally, and the rotation wouldn't matter then. The strength value changes the intensity of the wind. A value around 100 would look like a light breeze, while 5000 is pretty much a storm. The decay value sets the range of the wind. It determines how quickly the wind strength diminishes over distance from its original source. Higher values result in faster decay, while lower values cause the wind effect to persist over longer distances. With this setting, the position of the wind controller will majorly affect the outcome. The frequency value specifies the variation in the wind strength in seconds. With the default value of 0, the strength of the wind doesn't fluctuate. If you set it to 2, it'll cycle the strength in the interval of 2 seconds repeatedly. The turbulence value randomizes the strength of the wind. The higher the value, the more chaotic the intensity of the wind. Now you've probably noticed how there's a checkbox under each setting named Key Activate. Well, if you check this for any setting, that setting becomes animatable. So for example, if we turn on Key Activate for the rotation and translation, we can go to the animation editor and add a keyframe for the wind controller by right-clicking and selecting Add Wind Key. Then we can scrub ahead, change the rotation and position of the controller, and add another keyframe. If you scrub through, you'll see that the wind control is moving now. To update the deformations in the clothes, you can then go ahead and re-record the simulation and it'll take the animated wind controller into account. Another cool thing that was recently added to Marvelous Designer is the ability to add multiple wind controllers in the scene. To make a new one, you simply have to right-click on an existing one and click on Duplicate. Now you can manipulate this new one completely independently. Note that if you had keyframes on your existing wind controller, they don't carry over to the duplicate. You can delete the wind controller by right-clicking and selecting delete. If you end up deleting all your controllers, you can always use the scene browser to add them back in by going to Environment, Wind, right-clicking and selecting Create Wind Controller. That's pretty much everything about the wind controllers. You can get really creative with them and use them to add lots of environmental interactions and realism. The next thing I want to talk about is the Connect store, which can be accessed from the left panel here. This is a library of free and paid assets that you can download and use in your own projects. You can browse here, double-click, add to cart, place the order through the link that opens in your browser, and then you'll get access to the download links. Then you can either open the file as a project or add it into your existing project, retarget the draping, and use it as your own. Very useful if you find the exact type of clothing you need, or if you need to save time in this process of your artwork, or you're just lazy. A highly anticipated feature package in Marvelous Designer that was also recently added is EveryWear. First, I want to talk about remeshing though. Assuming that you finish your garment, you might want to export it to some other software for further refinement, texturing, and rendering. If we check the wireframe of our mesh here, it's all triangles and there's no way you can take this into another software and find any edge loops to work with. You cannot subdivide it or smooth it either, since the triangles will just turn into 3 more triangles with points sticking in and out, and it's going to ruin the whole curvature. There's a very simple fix to it though. Select your patterns in the 2D window, scroll down to the mesh category in the property editor. Here you can change the mesh style from triangle to quad optimized or quad grid. The quad optimized mode tries to use the least number of quads to generate the closest shape following all the original deformations. This leads to a smoother result after simulating it again compared to using triangles. However, you'll see that the edge loops are all over the place and there are lots of poles in unnecessary places. The quad grid mode, which was used to be a remesh checkbox in older versions of Marvelous, makes use of more computer resources and it takes a longer time to calculate, but it gives the smoothest possible result, and the entire mesh is neatly arranged in a grid pattern, giving you clean edge loops all over, except the edges of the pattern, which is to be expected since it's still a remeshing algorithm and not a manual retopology. But you can select the patterns you have remeshed, right click in the 3D window and select the remeshing to retopology option and select a target polygon count. It'll then use the remeshing as a reference to automatically create a topology under the given polygon count. Then you can use it as a base for your manual retopology. It's only recommended that you switch the mesh styles or mess around with remeshing after you have finished creating your garments, so you can use all of the features more efficiently. Now that we have a basic understanding of the optimization tools in Marvelous Designer, let's take a look at what EveryWear can do for us. Click on the EveryWear button on top and you'll get a window like this. There are 2 tabs named Garment and Material. In the Garment tab, there are options to optimize your mesh and apply rigging. In the Material tab, there are options for UV packing and texture baking. You'll also get a statistics overlay in the 3D window that shows you the polygon count for the garment as well as the avatar. In the Garment tab under Polygon Optimization, the numbers here for the garment and avatar represent the current polygon count for them. If you specify a number in this field and click on Optimize, it'll bring the poly count for the garment under this specified value. The topology will depend on what kind of mesh style you chose between tris, optimized quads, and grid quads. Next to the Optimize button, you'll see a brush icon. This is the mask brush and it lets you paint over areas of your garment to remove the faces there for optimization. You can paint directly in the 3D window, and they have also separated it into front and back for when you want to use the 2D window and get access to both sides. There's also a switch for add and subtract modes, so you can either apply or remove the mask as needed. You can also adjust the brush size, and if you want to start over, there's a clear all masks button to reset everything, and the reset button will reset the mode and size back to default. Once you've painted over an area, those faces will be completely removed from the mesh, reducing the overall poly count. This is particularly useful for removing hidden or unnecessary geometry such as layers underneath a jacket or fabric inside closed garments, ensuring a more optimized and efficient model. As for the rigging, it can't get any simpler. You just hit apply and Marvelous Designer will automatically rig the garments to your armature based on the avatar's weight paint. The max influence joints value determines how many joints can influence a single vertex. The higher this number, the smoother and more flexible the deformation, but it can also increase the complexity of your weight paint. If you need more rigid deformations, lowering this value can help limit excessive joint influence. To test out the rigging, you can apply a pose or animation to your avatar. If you notice any errors, click on the brush icon, hold Ctrl and select a bone to adjust its weight manually. The weight painting brushes work similarly to the sculpting window, and the red here indicates full influence, close to 1, while it gradients into blue, and then colorless for no influence, which means 0 weight. If you need additional control over the garment's deformations, you can use the Sculpt tab to manually move or smooth out wrinkles that are too intrusive. You can also use the Fix Intersection brush and draw over intersecting areas to fix them automatically. This helps refine the shape while maintaining a natural fit on the avatar. Moving on to the Material tab now, the first category is UV packing, and clicking on Pack UVs will bring up the same window and settings as doing it directly from the UV editor, so you can watch that part for more info. Then we have texture baking, and this feature allows us to bake a normal map and ambient occlusion map without having to load in a high poly mesh separately. Check these 2 boxes if you want both the textures and set the number of rays you want it to sample per pixel. The higher this number, the better the quality is going to be, but it also increases the processing time. After it's done baking, it'll look something like this. You can preview your maps by clicking on this icon, adjust the intensity of the normal map using this slider, and delete your maps by clicking here. Next is the material category, which is auto-generated based on the number of UV tiles. But you can always go ahead and duplicate or create new ones and assign it to different patterns. Clicking on a material will highlight the pattern pieces assigned to it. You can only delete the materials which are not assigned to any patterns. So if you want to delete this new one, just apply the original material to the pattern piece again and then you're free to delete it. Finally, you can click on this upload button and it'll bring up this pop-up menu. From here, you can select whether or not you want to include the avatar with your garment, the types of texture maps you want to include with it, and this embed media checkbox basically packs all of your textures into a zip file and uploads it along with the objects. And this graphic library option needs to be set according to the platform you're uploading to, since some of them use OpenGL and some of them use DirectX. I'm going to reset everything to default and then hit OK. This will open up a new browser tab for the Connect Upload webpage, from where you can preview and download as an FBX for your desired platform. This zip file contains your FBX file and the textures you chose to export. And that's basically all there is to the EveryWear feature in the beta state as of now. Now we're going to discuss the import-export options in Marvelous Designer and what I generally use for my own projects. I have this character made in Blender using Human Generator, which I'll use as an example for this part. If you go to the File tab, you'll see that there are two import menus here. One of them has add written inside brackets, and that means it'll add the file you choose into your existing project instead of opening it as a new project. This doesn't really matter when you're starting from scratch, but it's an important distinction and will be clear once we explore it further. These are the types of files that Marvelous can import as of now. You've probably heard of OBJ and FBX and probably heard of or use more of these depending on how experienced you are. Let's start by talking about OBJ. It's a very primitive format and it only supports geometry data and stuff related to it and nothing else. No cameras, no animations, nothing. I exported the avatar's animation as an OBJ sequence, but when I try to import an OBJ file in Marvelous Designer, it has no way of recognizing this sequence, so it can only bring in static objects. This can be used for when you want to bring in guide objects or accessories that help with the garment creation, or if you don't need animations on your character, then it's perfectly fine to bring your main avatar in as an OBJ. You'll see something like this when importing an OBJ file. You can set the load type to open or add depending on whether you want to start a new project or add it as a secondary avatar into an existing project. You can set the object type from here, and in this case we want to set it to avatar since it's a character. These two checkboxes will try to automatically create arrangement points and fitting suit, which comes in really handy, but it only works when the character is in a T pose or an A pose. Then you can set the scale unit and percentage here, and I know because I've tested this before that setting it to meters for OBJ gives me the most accurate scale. Then you get the option to convert the axis, since different software use different conventions. Like for example, Blender uses the Z axis as the up axis, while Maya considers it to be the Y axis. I already have it aligned while exporting from Blender, so this shouldn't be an issue. Align bottom to the ground checkbox, make sure that the feet are planted on the ground, then you can hit OK to import it. Then you can check if the arrangement points and fitting suit were generated correctly by turning on the overlays. The arrangement points look a little too spread out around the arms and there are some weird spots, but overall it has done a good job. The fitting suit looks great and it'll work very well when we try to redrape any existing outfit. Now, there's a way to work in A pose and then transition into your desired pose using OBJ, and that is to use morph targets. So let's go again to the import menu and select OBJ, and this time we'll pick a different pose. Switch it to add and change the type to morph target. The morphing frame count is the number of frames apart the two poses will be. So the higher this number, the longer it is going to take to interpolate from the A pose to this new pose. Now you can play it back in the animation editor and it'll smoothly transition from the A pose to this new pose. Next is OpenCollada, which is the .dae file extension. I personally don't use it at all and haven't felt the need to use it either. Even when exporting this character from Blender as a .dae file, I couldn't import it despite my best troubleshooting efforts and kept getting the same error. I tried using a different base character which was very simple and created a very simple armature and animated it directly, but I still couldn't import it. The only time it worked was when I imported the downloaded base mesh before rigging or animating it, so I feel like it's a hit or miss kind of a situation with this. The settings while importing a Collada file are exactly the same as OBJ, so there's that. Just try to use the other formats that I'll cover unless you really have to use this. FBX is a really popular format because it supports a lot of different types of data, including armatures, lighting, materials, and cameras, but we're only interested in the geometry and armature part in Marvelous Designer, and it handles that pretty well. The only problem with FBX is the scaling inconsistency because different software interpret it as different units. For my example character, I found that setting it to centimeters gives gives me the most accurate scaling. Most of the settings are same in every import menu, and we've discussed them in the OBJ import menu. What's different here are these options. The first checkbox is for choosing whether or not you want to import the cameras and animations associated with it into Marvelous. This FBX file contains an animated camera along with the mesh and armature so that I can showcase this feature. So we'll check this box. The joint animation checkbox means it'll import the animations linked to the bones of the character, and that should definitely be checked in this case. The cache animation checkbox should be checked if you want to import any soft body simulations, shape keys, and other kinds of animations in the character which are stored frame by frame instead of relying on the armature. Another new setting here is the move garment to start position checkbox, which is useful when you have root motion in your avatar. It will then change the existing garment's position to the starting position in the avatar's animation. In this case, we're starting from scratch, so it doesn't really matter. Hit OK to add it in, and it might give you an error like this sometimes where it isn't able to calculate the fitting suit properly. Maybe because your character isn't exactly in an A pose or a T pose, or it just couldn't identify it properly. It doesn't cause a huge issue. This feature is just there to save us a little bit of time. If it fails to auto-create the fitting suit, you can always create it manually in minutes. The reason I don't have textures in this file is because the materials for this avatar in Blender contains lots of nodes giving us the final textures, and I was just too lazy to bake them into a set of image textures that can be packed in the FBX file. But I think it's fine for this demo since we're more concerned about the geometry and animations importing properly rather than the textures, which if you're exporting from another software and have a use for them in Marvelous, then I'm sure you'll pack properly anyway. Besides, going through those settings and talking about proper texture packing here would be out of scope for this tutorial. Now let's check how we can access our important camera. For that, let's bring up the scene browser and head down to environment. You'll notice here that it says default camera and another camera down here. This is our important camera. Let's go to display, environment, and then show camera, and we will see the name of the camera that we're viewing from currently. If we right click on a camera in the scene browser, we can choose set as main camera to switch to it. If we move around in the viewport with this camera active, switch back to the default camera, and then switch back to the imported one again, you'll see that it stays where we left off in the viewport earlier. Also, if you check the timeline, you might see a track for the camera animation data, but if you scrub through it, the camera doesn't really seem to move. Not entirely sure if that's something I'm doing wrong, so just try it out and let me know if it works for you. But that's basically how importing cameras as an FBX file works. Next on the list is Alembic, and it's incredible for dealing with very complex animations involving simulations and stuff. Once you export an Alembic file, the animation is stored as a geometry cache, meaning that the geometry itself is refreshed every frame instead of relying on an armature that moves that geometry. It doesn't support shaders, so you'll see the default monochrome material applied in Marvelous after importing it. I honestly find it very reliable, and it's my go-to option for importing and exporting between Marvelous and Blender. If you check the import settings, you'll see that it has much fewer settings than the other files, so no creating auto arrangement points or fitting suits. Other than this and the fact that the file sizes can be really huge, it's a good option, especially for exporting from Marvelous Designer, which we'll discuss soon. Finally, we have USD, which is supposedly the ultimate format, and it's starting to be implemented in most software packages because of how powerful it is. It supports practically everything. It's smaller and faster than Alembic and can be used interactively between multiple software. The problem is, it's still relatively new and different apps support it in different degrees. So for this example character and also the simpler one, I've had multiple issues, but for simple static geometry, I found that it works just fine. And you can also make use of the Omniverse connector to create a live link and update changes interactively. I'll put links for this in the description if you want to dive deep into how it works, but for now, I'd say that OBJ, FBX, and Alembic are the best options for me because of the stability and predictability. These set of import options are for importing animation caches from different software, and I'll link the documentation for this part in the description for more details. We'll be covering these in detail in this video when we talk about the exporting from Marvelous Designer part, where this same set of caches are available. You'll also notice this extra options for importing Python scripts at the bottom. This allows users to run custom Python scripts to automate tasks or extend the functionality of the software. If you check the tabs above, you'll find this script tab where you get a dedicated Python console and also a link to the API documentation. The import add menu contains all of the same options except for this import OBJ as garment option. This is really just the same OBJ import menu but with the load type set to add and the object type set to garment. This will import any object and let us simulate it as a garment inside Marvelous. There is also this checkbox in the import menu, which if you check, it takes the UV map from the imported model and traces it and creates the patterns inside Marvelous. If you leave this unchecked, you can deform your imported object as a garment but cannot manipulate it in the 2D window. With this checkbox enabled, it creates all the necessary patterns and also automatically sews everything. We can import our example character in, increase the pressure from the property editor, and simulate it to get a human balloon. A new feature that was recently added in the latest version is the auto convert to avatar feature, which can take any character that you export and turn it into a Marvelous Designer avatar, like the ones you see in the library. Doing this will give you access to a lot of cool features that only work on these types of avatars, like size editing and soft body simulation, which we'll go over after this. To use this feature, you'll have to go to the Avatar tab, and there you'll find the option. This will bring up a menu like this. Select the FBX file of our example character and make sure whatever you choose here is in A pose, otherwise it may not work as intended. You'll see that it appears in the viewport along with a reference avatar. Set the gender here to be male in this case. Then we have the converting options, and if you hover over this tooltip icon, you'll get a good idea of what each setting does. Setting it to automatic will convert the body shape and replace the existing rig. However, if we want to keep the rig, we need to switch it to custom, maintain current rig. The exclude hands and feet checkbox will retain the hands and feet of the preset avatar in Marvelous Designer while converting the body shape. This must be turned on if your character doesn't have hands or feet so that it can utilize the default avatar's hands and feet instead. Then we have this category here, and one of these checkboxes must be ticked for the conversion. The first one will match the imported character's body shape as closely as possible and only change its appearance, like the materials and hair, to be one of the presets from the drop down as you choose. This will also add joints to the avatar as apparent from this rigging section being checked. The size editor part is crossed, which means that you cannot adjust its body shape after it's converted. The rigging only checkbox only adds the joints and keeps both the body shape and appearance of the original character. The size editable checkbox will keep the avatar intact but alter its body shape and add joints so that it supports size editing. Let's keep all of these on and set this file name and hit OK. Give it some time to do its thing, and once it's done, you'll see all three of your converted avatars in the viewport. As you can see, the first and second retained the muscular body type of the original character, whereas the third one has got more of an average body type. The first one got the appearance of the default avatar, but the second and third ones retained the original look. The cool thing about the third one is that you can go to the avatar editor under the avatar tab, and from here you can select any avatar you like. The first two will give you this error, but the third one, we can actually adjust every single measurement of his body as we like, make him really tall, fat, or lean. If we check the arrangement points on these avatars, you can see that the ones that kept the original body shape also have the same type of arrangement points as when we just imported the FBX directly, but the third one converted it to be more precise. This is not a huge deal though, since you can always use the avatar editor, head to the arrangement section and offset these arrangement points, or even change the size of the bounding volumes to fix it overall. I'll delete these two over here and just keep the third one now. Since it's a converted avatar, we can make use of the poses and animations in our library that are actually meant for the default avatars. The best part about this is the fact that we can now use soft body simulation to simulate how clothes would interact with the skin, like how tight clothing would kind of stretch out the fat from that part and such. To turn it on, you have to select the avatar, go to the property editor and turn on soft body simulation checkbox and set a stiffness value here. If I now create a simple band around his waist and exaggerate the elasticity of that band, you'll see how the body deforms according to the tightness of the band. This is a very new addition in Marvelous, and I'm really excited to make use of it in future projects. Let's now talk about the export options. For this, I'll be using one of the default avatars with some changes to the measurements, with the sportswear garment from the Connect store and the motion applied and with soft body simulation turned on. Let's head to the library and add a material to this by going to Substance, and I'm going to drag and drop this one onto our main fabric. In the fabric panel, I'm going to select the newly added fabric and then go to the property editor and change the color and the tiling using the height and width values. I'm going to make 2 copies of this fabric and assign it to the other parts of the garment, darken it, and increase the tiling. Now let's record the simulation, and finally we'll have this that we want to export. Let's go to the export menu and select OBJ and type in a file name. Now we get this OBJ export menu. Firstly, we can select or deselect specific patterns that we want to export, select the avatars that we want to export, select the trims and graphics that we want to export, but in this project we have none of them. Then we get to choose whether we want to export everything as a single object or have them all separate. Then you can select whether you want the pattern pieces to be 2D, which is what happens when you select thin, and they get solidified when you select thick, which is useful if you want to have accurate thickness of the fabric that you set here in Marvelous. If you pick single object and thin, you also get the option to weld the patterns together, which will turn the sewn parts into a single object and the other parts separate, and also get the option to merge the vertices by proximity according to the merge distance that you set here. You get this this really neat preview right inside the export window where you can highlight the merged vertices. In this case though, I want to set it to multiple objects and thick, so we won't be getting those options. Next is the Unified UV Coordinates checkbox, which takes all the UVs from separate pattern pieces and combines them into a single UV map or UDIMs, depending on how you did your unwrapping. And we need to enable it if we want to export textures. Once you enable it, you can choose the texture resolution, the number of pixels of seam filling you want to apply, which will be reflected in the 2D window here. You want to set it not too high that it bleeds into other patterns, but it's great for hiding the seams and preventing artifacts. Select the texture maps that you want to export, and I'm just going to deselect the metalness map here. Include hidden object when enabled will export the hidden objects in the project as well, but since we do not have any, it doesn't really matter if it's checked or not. Include internal shape will retain all the internal shapes and lines, and it will reflect in the wireframe. If this is unchecked, it will only export the primary external shapes, and I want to keep this checked here. The scale and scale percentage and axis conversions will depend on which software you're exporting to. I'll just leave it as is, because you can change these in most software while importing anyway. Under the file category, this option ensures that the file contains specific paths to the texture images on your computer. However, it also means that if the texture images are relocated or their paths are altered, you may encounter issues while loading the textures. This other option exports the .obj file, .mtl file, and the texture images used in the garment as one compressed file, and I'm going to go for this option. The Save with Metadata checkbox will export the mesh, the physical properties, the sewing information as metadata, so that you can import it back into Marvelous to retrieve all of that information and it won't be lost. When everything looks good, you can hit OK to start the export process. I imported the file in Blender with the scale set to 0.1, and it came with all the materials with the textures assigned properly. With a little bit of tweaking, I got the transparency right as well, and this is what it looked like. Of course, being OBJ, there is no animation and it's just the A pose or whatever pose you had while exporting. Then we have OBJ selected, and this means that it will only export whatever we currently have selected in the viewport. So let's say I select only the pattern pieces for the pants and click on it. You'll see that it's the same export window but with the pattern pieces pre-selected, which saves us some time. Importing it into Blender, we can see that only the pants are imported. Next is FBX, and the first checkbox is for avatar selection, but it also contains this drop-down menu from where you can select whether you want to include the rig or not. Earlier with the OBJ, it was just geometry data being exported, but now you can export the rig as well as the animation from these two checkboxes, where joint animation is the avatar's animation from the rig and cache animation is the simulated stuff. If you're using a custom character which was imported as an FBX file and it had a rig, you can export it again with the rig still intact, but any other format would not allow you to export the rig again. It doesn't matter in this case because it's a preset avatar, and of course they have to make it compatible, so we will be able to export the rig. From this section, you can select the type of FBX file you want to export between binary and ASCII. Binary stores the data in zeros and ones, and that makes the file size small and the read-write speeds high. ASCII, SC, I don't know how to say it, but it basically stores the data in plain text, which reduces the efficiency but makes debugging really easy. Most modern software support both of them, but I'm going to keep it at binary for this. Then you can choose the SDK version, and I'm going to leave it at default and recommend you to do so as well unless your software doesn't support the latest version. For the textures, I'm going to select embed media so that the textures ship with the FBX file. The rest of the settings are the same as OBJ, but make sure you set it to single object if you want to export the animation. Hit OK to export, and once it does its thing, it'll give you 3 files: the FBX for the geometry and rigging data, an MCX file for the mesh cache, and a .xml file that contains the metadata. If we try to import the FBX into Blender, you'll see that it looks like it imports fine. It has got the textures and everything, but when you play it back, there's only the joint animation and not the mesh animation. That's because the mesh cache is in the MCX format, which only Maya uses, and Blender cannot import .mcx files natively, and there are no add-ons that give you this feature for free that I know of. If we were to import this FBX file into Maya, it will import just fine with the materials and the animation. If it still doesn't load the animation properly, you can switch to the FX menu set, select the clothing, go to Ncache, attach cache, and then select the MCX file, which will then load the cache into the selected object. Now we get into Alembic, which is my favorite way to export stuff from Marvelous Designer. In the Alembic export window, you'll first see the file type dropdown, which lets you choose between the older HDF5 type and the newer Ogawa type. So unless you're exporting to a software that does not support the newer storage type, you want to keep this at Ogawa because it's faster with a lower file size. The rest of the settings are similar, but we have this new checkbox called include avatar shape, which will export the avatar along with the garment. Also, another point to note is that if you have soft body simulation on your avatar, Alembic is the only way as of now that can export it. In this section, you can select whether you want the entire animation from start to finish, or just a part of the timeline, or just the current frame. I want everything, so I'll leave it at entire region. Finally, the strain and stress checkboxes export this data as the vertex colors of the mesh if you want to visualize it or use it for more simulations or shaders in other software. If we now import it into Blender, you can see that it imports everything along with the animation perfectly, just with the exception of the materials. But the image textures are exported separately along with the Alembic file, so you can set it up pretty easily. Now suppose we want to preview the stress and strain maps. In that case, we can open this shading drop-down menu and change the color to attribute, and then go to the data tab and select the stress or strain map from the color attribute section to see how it changes according to the animation. Then there's the USD export option, and there's a whole system of dealing with USD files in Marvelous Designer, where it lets you connect to the Omniverse connector and get the USD layers right inside here. But honestly, I don't feel qualified enough to cover it in this video since I have yet to use it in my own real projects, so I'll just put some links to useful resources that cover this topic. Anyway, if we check the export menu for USD files, you'll get the options to include or exclude the mesh and or the materials along with their prim path, and the rest of the settings are pretty much the same. We can then open this USD file in an app like USD Composer or directly in Unreal Engine, and it'll have all the materials along with the mesh data. And whenever you make any change and export and override the USD file, you can fetch those changes in the USD Composer or Unreal. No animation as of now though. But there's also a fix for that, since there's Flow Live Sync plugin for Unreal Engine that connects them seamlessly and can allow users to export garments with simulation data from Marvelous to UE, and also bring in animated metahumans from UE to Marvelous. There also exists GoZ that links Marvelous Designer to ZBrush. I'll put links to videos that go over all these tools, so make sure you check the description if you're interested in making your workflow more efficient. That's all for the major export options, and now we have all the animation cache export options. The first two are specifically for Autodesk Maya, and these store point cache data including vertex animations, so you can export all of your garment simulations with these. And if you remember, when we exported the FBX, the mesh cache was exported as an MCX file. The MCX format is designed to work with newer versions of Maya and gives improved performance and additional features over the MC format. The third option is Point Cache 2, which has a greater compatibility with multiple software, primarily 3ds Max and Maya. Blender also supports PC2 files, and you can use it by adding the mesh cache modifier on your exported FBX garment with the format set to PC2. Same goes for the next option called MDD Cache Standard, and it's compatible with a wide variety of software including Blender using the same mesh cache modifier. The MDD Cache Maya/3ds Max is a variation of the same format, which is tailored for better compatibility with Maya and 3ds Max. Lastly, we have OBJ sequence, which exports each frame of the animation as a separate OBJ file, and in that way it's sort of a workaround to exporting animations as OBJ, since it's a file format that only supports static meshes. This is incredibly inefficient both in terms of performance and storage, so I wouldn't really use this method unless I really needed to. At the bottom you'll also see this bone information JSON export option in Marvelous Designer, which can be used to export bone and skeletal structure data in a JSON format. I've tested it out. It exports a .boi file that contains the transformation matrices for each joint and the relative positions and orientations of joints to create a skeleton hierarchy for the current frame of the animation. You can then write a parser to analyze this data and apply those transformations to the correct joints. Now that's all for importing and exporting stuff, but I quickly want to talk about the proprietary file formats in Marvelous that you can use to save and store different types of data. If you go to File and then Save As, you'll see a bunch of different saving options. The first is the project file, which is the type of file that gets saved by default. It contains all the avatar related data like the avatar, accessories, arrangement bounding volumes, arrangement points, the avatar size, poses, etc. And also the garment related data, that is the 3D garments, the 2D garments, the fabrics, materials, as well as the animation data. The second option with the metadata exports an XML file with the project file that contains the following additional data. The garment file contains information on garments, patterns, sewing, and fabrics without the avatar or scene settings, ideal for sharing garments or adding them to a library for future use. The trim file only contains the OBJ files in your project. If we were to save the trims in this project, it'll give us this menu to choose between the trims and preview it in the viewport as well. You can then go to Open, Trim, and select the trim file to add it in the exact position as before or reset it to the world origin. If you save it to one of the library folders, you can access it directly from here as well. file. The avatar file contains all the information related to the avatars, the model, sizing data, the poses, motions, accessories, bounding volumes, and arrangement points, useful for saving custom avatars for reuse in different projects. Then there's the pose file that only contains the avatar's pose info. You can find these types of files in the library in an avatars folder inside the pose folder, and these can be used to change the pose of the avatar very easily later. You can also save these poses for custom avatars from other software only when you import them in the Open Collada format. The hand pose file contains specific information about the avatar's hand positions, enabling us to custom hand gestures independently of the full body pose. As an example, I'll save this custom pose here in both the pose and the hand pose formats. Now if you bring in another avatar and open the main pose file, you'll see that she inherits that custom pose. But now we also have the flexibility of using a completely different pose, but just opening the hand pose file and affecting only the hands. Inside the pose folder of any avatar in the library panel, you should also see a hand pose folder containing some common presets ready for use. The joint motion file contains the avatar's joint animations. As with the pose file, you can only save this for custom avatars imported in the Collada format. The scene and props option is for saving stuff that you import as scene and props, and it looks something like this in the library. The modular file saves the modular template that exists in the file. The camera projection file contains the camera's field of view information, the near, far, etc. The camera transformation file contains the camera's view information of the 3D garment window. When you open these two files, you can retrieve the exact angle and the settings of the camera again. The surface textures option lets you save all the texture images used on garments and subsidiary materials to a designated folder. When you select a folder, you get the options to save the original textures or crop them by a specific number of pixels. The preferences file stores the current preferences like window layouts, simulation properties, view controls, and other customizations that you make inside the preferences window, and can also be saved through this button. With all of that discussed, I think we have covered the most important tools, concepts, and technicalities of the software, and I feel like you can use the video up till now to use as a guide to look up specific information whenever you're feeling lost or confused, or even as a refresher. Now that we're done with the theory part, we're ready to put all of this knowledge to practical use. If you've skipped all of it to get to this part, it's okay as long as you have a basic understanding of how the software works. If you're completely new, I recommend that you at least watch the first part of the video where I go over the navigation controls. That being said, let's learn a few principles about how clothing is made in real life and then create something on our own. Let's take the example of a t-shirt. The first step is designing and planning, where designers create sketches or digital drawings of the t-shirt, considering style, fit, and fabric. Then, certain technical specifications are considered, including measurements, stitching types, and fabric choices. Then comes probably the most important part in the process, pattern making. A pattern maker creates templates for each part of the t-shirt, the front, back, sleeves, collar, etc., using the design specifications. And a prototype t-shirt is made to ensure the design and fit are correct. This process is sort of like UV unwrapping, and like there are more efficient ways to, let's say, cut a cube or a cylinder to ensure the most efficient unwrap, there are also certain standards for how a bodice and sleeve pattern should be. Once the patterns are ready, large rolls of fabric are spread out and cut into individual pieces with the help of the patterns. This can be done manually or with the help of automated cutting machines. Then there's sewing, and typically the front and back bodice patterns are sewn first, followed by the sleeves and the collars, and then hems to finish it up. There are different types of seams depending upon the garment's design, function, and the type of fabric used. Some common types are the plain seam, French seam, serged or overlocked seam, double stitch seam, top stitch seam, etc., just to name a few. After the base clothing is ready, then it's time to add the printing and embellishment, and this is where different kind of printing methods are used, such as screen printing, direct to garment or DTG printing, sublimation, etc., and additional details such as embroidery, patches, or special finishes are added. Finally, the finishing touches like cutting loose threads are made, then the branding tags and labels are attached, and the finished piece of clothing is packaged and distributed. When it comes to digital fashion, we can bypass and simplify a lot of these steps and processes. We don't have to worry about seam allowances or taking perfect measurements, because everything can be changed at any point of the process. However, the primary principles of pattern making stay the same, and the more you understand pattern making, the easier it will be for you to create complex garments. For the next part of the video, where we'll be creating an outfit from scratch, we're not going to concern ourselves with perfect measurements and sort of play around and tweak the basic patterns until we get the fit that we're looking for. The stitches that are visible from the outside can be easily faked using the tools provided by Marvelous Designer. Now that we have a basic overview of the process, we can finally get into the fun part of actually creating the garment. after careful consideration, I've decided to use Lara Croft's desert tank top outfit from the game Rise of the Tomb Raider as an example for this part of the video. The fact that she's a popular video game character will allow us to get a lot of references from both the digital character as well as the cosplays that other people have done. It's basically a grey tank top, basic pants, which if you learn how to create, you can basically recreate any kind of modern clothing. And then there's the leather belt and holster, which makes it just challenging enough for you to be proud of what you create by the end, while not being too overwhelming for a beginner. I'm going to cover all of the steps from start to finish, but if you find my pacing a little too fast, I recommend that you watch this whole section first once, and then rewatch and pause it from time to time to recreate your outfit, instead of trying to follow along in real time. Now the first step for us is collecting lots of references. I use a program called PureRef, which lets you create these infinite boards, and it lets you overlay this on top of any software that you use, which is really handy. If you want to follow along with the same set of references that I have, I'll leave a link to this PureRef board in the description, along with a bunch of other stuff that you can download for free. Now our workflow is going to look like this. We're going to create a metahuman that resembles Lara Croft and import it into Unreal Engine where we can pose it. And using the Clo Live Sync plugin, we can bypass the importing and exporting steps and get immediate updates across Marvelous Designer and Unreal Engine. We'll design the garments in Marvelous and then finally bring them into Unreal for the final render. If you haven't worked with metahumans or Unreal Engine before, I'll link some video in the description that I watched to learn the techniques that I just mentioned. If you want to work directly with a metahuman without making any changes to its body, Marvelous already has a bunch of them in this metahuman folder. So you can just simply drag one of these in and just use this instead of importing an actual metahuman, because the body shape is exactly the same. Now the first thing that you want to do is go to the link in the description where you'll find the link to the Live Sync plugin. And this is required if you want to create the live update between Unreal Engine and Marvelous Designer. So it's pretty simple. You just hit this download button and then you have to scroll down to where it says MD Live Sync, and you have to match your Unreal Engine version with the latest version. So in my case, it's 1.1.6 because I'm using Unreal 5.5. So I'll just download this one. Now, once you've downloaded it, you want to extract this folder into this path right here. You also want to download the Substance plugin for Unreal Engine if you want to export your Substance materials from Marvelous Designer to Unreal Engine, which we will go over later. Okay, now we need to do a little bit of setup. So first go to Edit and then Plugins and search for Metahuman. You want to make sure this is checked if you want to work with your metahumans. And now search for Clo Live Sync. Right, this one, you want to enable this. This is the actual Live Sync plugin that we installed in the root folder earlier. And now, finally, you want to enable the Substance plugin. Yeah, just enable it. Now close that out and go to Edit and then Project Settings this time. And you want to search for Default RHI. Set this one to DirectX 11 instead of 12. And then search for Order Independent Transparency. You want to make sure this is checked. So according to the documentation, when you want to use Lumen in Unreal Engine, you have to turn on DirectX 11 and enable the Order Independent Transparency. However, if you want to use DirectX 12, then you have to check this off and you have to make sure that you use the path tracer instead of Lumen. So those are the two configurations that ensure that your workflow from Marvelous Designer to Unreal is as smooth as possible. So once you make these changes, go ahead and restart Unreal Engine and it'll save your settings. Now I'm not going to go over how to import metahumans and all that, but you can check the description and comment section for help. In my case, I already have everything set up with the Lara Croft metahuman imported and her body mesh slightly altered. I also have a level sequence set up where she goes from the A pose to this pose right here, which is kind of similar to how the reference looks. Anyway, the next step is to right click where it says body right here and then go to create linked animation sequence. Give it a name and pick your folder and hit OK. And just keep the default settings and hit this button here right here. And now we will have something like this and you'll see your metahuman right here. Let's dock this for now and go back to the main window. And now we want to go to Window and open this Clo MD Live Sync editor. So you want to have this open right here if you want to export the metahuman to Marvelous Designer, and also make sure Marvelous Designer is open. So you want to think of this Live Sync editor as something that you import your garments into, and the exporting is going to be done right here inside the animation sequence window where it says Live Sync. So you want to click this as Live Sync, skeletal mesh. This is all fine. Click on it. All the default settings work. Just hit export. And now if you go back to Marvelous Designer, you'll see that your MetaHuman was imported successfully. Hopefully. So if anything goes wrong, just let me know in the comments and I'll help you. Anyway, you want to make sure that the animation imported correctly. So let's go to the animation editor here, change it to real time. Let's play it. Perfect. So yeah, this imported really well. And now we can start creating the outfit. Now wait a minute. How do we start exactly? How do we know what shape to create in the 2D window that it results in a tank top or a trouser in the 3D window? So to fix that exact issue, I've created the Essential Pattern Overlay collection for Marvelous Designer, which contains a bunch of these basic building blocks of patterns that you can easily import into Marvelous Designer and get started with your garment right away. So let's see how we can start now. You want to right click in the 2D window and go down to where it says Add Background Image. This will bring up a pop-up menu like this, and you want to select the image file. So we're going to add the tank top overlay first. And as you can see, this is really small right now. So let's bump it up to like 900. And I know this because I've tested it out. But yeah, it should be around 900 to 1200% for this pack specifically. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Anyway, I'm going to drop the opacity down to 20% and hit OK. So now if you have watched the earlier sections, you know how to create a pattern. It's this tool right here. And we want to select polygon for this because using this, we're going to be able to create these curves and everything in one go. So let's start right here. I'm going to go straight to this part and don't worry about the curves right now. Just make sure you cover the complete silhouette. Holding down Shift will snap it to the axis. So for this part, we're going to hold Shift. And actually, let me turn on my screen keys so that it's easier to follow. There we go. This should be easier. So for this part, I'm just going to connect here and then back to where we started from. And as you can see, we got this first pattern. And now let's work on the curves. So press C to switch to the Edit Curvature tool. And now we're going to gently click on this edge, bring it down like so. We're just going to work on this left half and then we're going to mirror it to the other side. It doesn't have to match the reference perfectly, but just make sure to align it as properly as you can. You can also press Z to switch to the Edit Pattern tool and then you get these handles to tweak them more precisely. There we go. I think this is good enough. So let's press Z and select this edge right here. Right click and then select Unfold Symmetric Editing with Sewing. This is going to unfold the pattern onto the other side. And it's also going to make sure that whatever changes we make to this part also gets updated on this one. So this speeds up our process quite a bit. Now for the back pattern, I'm just going to press A, switch to the Transform Pattern tool. I can't remember the names of any of these tools. It's built into my muscle memory. So you just have to practice. Press Ctrl C and Ctrl V, paste it right here. Let's make sure it's as centered as possible. So right there is good enough. Now let's tweak this pattern so that it matches this other reference here. Now we have traced the pattern successfully. And now let's place the pattern on the back side like so. And if you press Simulate now, it's just going to fall down. And this is not what we want. So we're going to have to add some stitching. And the way you do that is by pressing N or going to the segment sewing tool right here. And you can do this both in the 3D and the 2D windows. So just select the edge and connect it to the other edge like this. You just have to do one side, and since we have the symmetry enabled, it'll automatically update on the other side. So this top part of the sleeve right here and the sides here. And now we should be ready to simulate. There we go. Perfect. Adjust it a bit. And of course, this is not what Lara Croft's tank top actually looks like. So we're going to have to do a bit of tweaking. Let's maximize this so that I can explain what to do. You can see right here that the strap is pretty thin. So that's the first change we have to make. And the next part is the back right here. It's a lot more deeply cut. So let's make these changes quickly. And I'm also noticing that our front bit is a bit too cut out as well. So we're just going to raise that up. And this is usually just going to be a matter of personal taste because you might not be using this tutorial just to recreate the Lara Croft outfit. So yeah, just take your time with this. I'm also going to switch to the random color surface mode so that I have a better idea of what's going on. Now to work on the straps right here, you can already see that these are not aligning properly. That's why we had this point right here. And if you want to match them exactly, then there's a shortcut for it. So you select this edge and this edge, right click, go to matchup to start. So this will flip up the pattern and match it exactly to this edge right here, which is really handy when you work on stuff like the straps. If you don't want this point right here, all you have to do is make sure that these are 90° exactly. There we go. And I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward this process of making the straps. There we go. I think we're almost there. Now let's work on the side here a little bit. And yeah, I think this is a really good start. So the straps are nice and thin. They don't have any pointedness, and the front looks fine too. Now, what's the difference here? This bit is really tight. This bit, it's pretty tight. It's snug to her body. So how do we create it here? Well, we could just make the whole pattern thinner, but we only need it in this part because this part is broader. The area around the hip, it's broader. So we can maybe create a curve like this on both the patterns, and this will tighten up this part only. Nice. So we're getting some really nice wrinkles here, but it's not too overpowering, or it doesn't look too loose. This is a good start. Let's just leave the tank top like this for now and work on the pants next. So what I'm going to do to make sure that this doesn't go anywhere or doesn't change during the simulation when we work on our pants, we're going to select everything in the 2D window and right click in the 3D window on top of the garment and select deactivate pattern and sewing. So this will turn off the collisions as well as freeze the existing simulations on our garment. And now we can just go ahead and hide the 3D pattern, which the shortcut to it is Shift plus Q. So there, that's gone. We don't have to worry about it anymore. So we can just put it to the side or on top like this. And now let's load in the pattern overlay for the pants. So we can right click here, go to edit background image, and then load in the pants. I've done this, so I know it's probably around 12 or maybe 1300, the scale. We can just put it to the side for now because I don't plan to trace the patterns here. I'm just going to use it as a guide to work on our pants. Now, instead of starting from scratch again, I'm just going to use the preset garment, and you'll see that there's a pant right here. Very handy. So we're just going to drag and drop it into the 3D window, and there we have it. It's a little too big for her right now, but let's just position it around the waist. Simulate it. Fix the upper part here because we're going to trim down the bottom anyway. And the way you do that is you select the bottom part on both sides, right click, offset, pattern, outline. And now you'll see this pop-up menu where you have to select retract instead of extend. And so this will remove whatever distance you set here and it'll offset it inside instead of extending it. So let's go for like 150 because I want to start really short and then we can extend it later if we want to. There we go. It could still be shorter, I think. So let's go another 50. Okay, nice. So this would be a nice place to start. If we check our reference here, you can see that these two patterns match with the left leg front and right leg front. So that's what they are. And these two correspond to the back sides of both legs. Now, what else we need to prioritize next is the question. So you'll see right here, there's a waistband. It looks kind of funky, but we'll get there. So let's just simply start with a rectangle. So I'm just going to bring it down a little bit so that we can see the silhouette. Let's select the rectangle tool. I'm just going to draw myself a really nice and long waistband. So this is only one half of it right here. Now, how do I wrap this around the waist right here? So even if this is only half of the waistband, I would still want to curve it around her waist like this on this part. How do we do it? So that's where we use arrangement points. So you can go to this avatar view right here and switch to arrangement points, but you'll see that it does nothing right now. And that's because we imported our MetaHuman, but we haven't set up anything that tells Marvelous Designer that this is an avatar yet. So we're going to go to the avatar tab right here and go to avatar editor. And right here, we can reset our arrangements so that we get the default and basic ones. So if you click on this reset bounding volumes button, you'll see that we get these blue dots appearing right here. So we can switch them on. And now if we select our pattern and click on one of these dots, you can see that it curved around the waist very nicely, exactly what we wanted. And the shortcut to turn these arrangement points on and off is Shift F. You can get really fast in Marvelous Designer if you can manage to remember some of these shortcuts. Anyway, create the other side of this pattern. So I'm just going to right click, go symmetric pattern with sewing and paste it right here. This will automatically wrap it around the other side. So now all that's left is to set the sewings. So we have to sew this part to this and the other part is left. So let's just do that quickly. And now if we hit simulate, there we have our waistband. Very nice. Now I'm just going to freeze this for a second. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to retain this circular shape while I connect or while I sew the pants to the waistband. You have to observe that this is the left side, right? If you can call it this, the left side. So this will be sewn onto these two patterns. And since we have to sew two parts to one part, we're going to use the MN segment sewing tool. And it's really important to remember the direction that you're sewing in. So if we click here, you'll see that it corresponds to this part in the pattern. So we can start clicking here. And this is already the M part of the sewing. So we can press enter. And now it'll begin the N part of the sewing. And we want to correspond it to this part. So this is here. Let's click on it. Next, we want to continue, if you can imagine, continuing the sewing to here. This is where the pattern is changed. So we can click here, press enter, and there we go. You want to make sure that all of the lines are parallel and it looks beautiful. So let's press space to simulate. There we go. There is a bit of gathering here because the waistband is smaller than the total combined length of the pattern pieces. But this shouldn't be an issue if we just select the waistband, go to the 3D window and just unfreeze it. Let's pull it down so that the waistband gets stretched. And now you must be wondering why this waistband looks a little different than this one. It's all straight. That's because this waistband was created by keeping in mind the fact that the waistband goes in a slanting way like this, not just completely horizontal like the one we have. So we can select these two parts, merge them, and we can raise this part maybe around there. That looks pretty good. Okay, now to avoid the pointiness, all we have to do is make sure that the corners are making 90 degrees or around 90 degrees. There we go. That's perfect. We probably want to increase the length of the waistband just a bit because it still is giving us a bit of gathering here. And this is a bunch of trial and error. You have to keep that in mind. I also want to increase the thickness of the band. Yep, right around that looks fine. And give it a bit of curvature. Perfect. So you can see how smooth this is. This is exactly what we needed. And you can see that the final shape resembles the reference waistband quite a bit. Now let's take a look at what the next step would be. So our pants right here are very, very loose. So this pattern is called slim jeans. And if you see here, the patterns are quite a bit thinner than what we have going on here. The obvious solution is just to decrease the length of these parts and it'll automatically tighten itself. So let's go ahead and do that. First, I also want to bring this point up. So let's start here, both the sides, bring it up, simulate it. And yeah, I think it's much tighter now. Maybe you can go a little bit further. This is good enough for now. Now let's go ahead and make the whole pattern thinner. So I'm going to select the outermost edge. I'm going to right click, offset pattern outline, and retract it by 50 millimeter. That's already much better. I think we can also reduce the curvature here so that it's tighter around this part. Nice, we're getting there. And we also want to make sure that it tapers and becomes tighter at this part. Okay, I think this is really good. Now to get these nice folds here, we have to make it a bit longer. Now if you want to make our pants a bit longer, we have to select these edges here and we want to bring them down, but do it really slowly. Do it a little bit at a time. So let's start with this much, simulate it, scoop it up, do it again, just a bit, hit simulate, and I think we have found our perfect length. Let's see. Yep, that's looking pretty nice. I think it's still a little bit loose around the knees. So I'm just going to curve it up like this. Curve it inwards. There we go. Yeah, you just basically have to play around with the curves and the lengths to properly get the fit that you want, and you want to spend the most time here because this is going to affect pretty much everything later down the line. So I'm just going to see you after I'm done tweaking. What? Okay, I think we're at a good position now. We have most of the folds located at the bottom part here, and the top part is pretty tight. So now let's talk about how we can create these details here, like the pockets and the J stitch here and these stitches here and this big cargo pocket on the right side, on both sides actually. And yeah, let's get into it. So basically all of these things, these details are going to start off with internal lines. So that's all the stuff that we create inside the patterns. You can find the internal shape tool group right here. And I'm going to go for the internal line tool, the shortcut to which is G. So that's going to be really handy if you can memorize it. Let's start with the J stitch here. So that's this part here where the zipper goes. And it's fairly easy to create. You just start from the outline. And if you hold Control while creating the second point, this will turn into a curve point. So now you can just go ahead and close it off on this side of the pattern here. Press Enter. And there we go. We have our J stitch. But of course, it's very ugly right now. So let's fix that. So you can press Z again to go to the edit pattern tool. So let's start with the outlines. Maybe somewhere around here is fine. You really just want to be looking at the reference while deciding where it goes. And we can use the curvature tool to smoothen this out so that it's not so curvy. I think this looks pretty good, pretty accurate. Now let's move on to the pockets. And again, we can use the internal line tool for this part as well. So G, and I'm just going to speed this part up because it's really boring and I often forget to talk when I'm really concentrating on this stuff. So I'll just fast forward. Now we have to create these lines here. And this is just going to be a rough estimate as to where it should be. That's a little too high, so I'll just bring it down. And to trim it to the outline, I'm just going to right click, go to Extend, Extend/Trim, and to Pattern Outline. So this will trim it nicely to the outline. Now we can copy this and find out where the other section is. So it's right now around here, below the knee, above the boots. So that should be right around here. Paste it there and trim it again. Nice, so we've got all the basic stuff down. Now it's time for the pocket. And this pocket is tricky because as you can see here, we have two patterns here and it goes across the two patterns. We can estimate where it goes in the 2D window, but that's not very ideal, is it? So we're just gonna do it in the 3D window and the tool for it is the line tool. So go here, we'll click on the line 3D pattern tool. And now let's see where we can draw it. So judging from the reference, it's just below the butt and a few inches above the knee. I want to check what it looks like from the front here. So it's right there, somewhere around here. So I think I'm good to go. Let's start right here. Go straight across. I'm holding the Shift key to make it straight. And somewhere around here is fine. Great. Now we're going to go down. Knee should be around here. So right there, go across again. This is 91.6. Yeah, this is fine. And there we go. There we have our pattern. You can edit this pattern. If you made any mistakes or you want to tweak it, you can just go to the edit line tool, click on any pattern and just move it around. For our first try, this actually turned out really good. Now the next step would be to turn this line into an internal shape. So double tap to select the whole line, right click, and then go to Convert Internal Shape. And there we have it. It's in our 2D window now. And there's no way we could have made this by hand and gotten the placement so accurate. Now that we have all of the guidelines that we needed to start creating the pockets and stuff, now we can actually go ahead and create the pockets. So starting with the side pocket here, if you check our guide overlay here, you can see what the pocket pattern looks like. So this part, this curve part here, it corresponds to this curve part right here. So it is cut off. And this is the actual pocket that goes inside the pant. So it sits right below this pattern right here. It sits right there. And this pocket left out here is the one that's going to go right here. This is probably very confusing, but let's do it step by step and then maybe you'll have a better idea. So let's first create the inside of the pocket. So I'm going to use the internal line tool again. Go like this, like that. I'm actually going to turn both of these into curve points and then tweak the curve. It doesn't really matter what it looks like on the inside, but yeah, we want to make it nice and spacious because it'll bulge out on the front a little bit. It's not exactly like the reference because the original outfit was probably just sculpted and not simulated. So it doesn't have a lot of these realistic properties. Like if there are pockets here, there would be a little bit of a bulge all the way here. But the fabric is denim, so I don't know. It's just an educated guess. So yeah, you don't really have to create the pockets. You can just fake it by having an internal line there. But I want to show you how to create pockets so that you can apply this knowledge to your other garments. Now let me introduce you to a new tool. I is the shortcut and it is called the trace tool. So what it allows you to do is select all of these patterns, select the boundaries. And if you now right click and select trace as pattern, you'll get the exact replica as a new pattern right here. So let it process. Yeah, there we go. Now that we have the pattern piece for the inside of our pocket, we actually want to delete this part right here so that we can expose what's inside, if you get what I'm saying. So it's pretty simple to do that actually. So you just double tap here, right click and select cut. This will cut this part into an extra pattern and now you can just go ahead and delete it. And now we have to stitch this inside pocket to the rest of the pants so that it sits there nicely. So let's see how we can do that. First of all, we don't really need this internal line anymore, so we can just go ahead and delete it. Now, if you notice, this part is going to be empty in the sewing as well. So that's the indication for the first part that needs to be sewn. So we're going to use free sewing now. Select this part of the pocket, go here. This is the empty part, the missing part of the waistband. So it's pretty simple that we just have to stitch it right here. Next is this. So select this part and this is the back pattern. So we already have a gap for it. Just click here. There we go. And finally, and this is the easiest part, you just press N, you stitch this part to this part and hit simulate and there we go. But you can see that the pocket is actually outside instead of being inside. So the way we can fix this is by using layers. Select everything, go to the property editor, and we're going to assign this a layer of 1. So that's 1 above, right? So if we just only select the pocket now and set it to 0, that's going to mean that it's inside. So it's a layer below. There we go. We have a nice little pocket right here. Very nice. Okay, now what do we do about this hard seam right here? Because we don't see this in real garments. So the way to fix it is actually pretty simple. You just go to the edit sewing tool, select this sewing, and under this category, just turn down the intensity to 0. Give it a bit of time to process. And there we go. The seam line is gone. And if you also want to get rid of this hard fold right here, that's also very easy. You just have to select the internal line and you have to turn off fold rendering. And there we go. Smooth as butter, but it still gives us that bit of a bulge that we were looking for. That sells the realism that there's an actual pocket inside there. Now we also have to delete this part right here. It's already cut because we did that operation on this side. And now all that's left to do is select this pattern and Control D and paste it here. This will keep all of the sewing. So it's basically like right clicking and going to clone pattern with linked editing. It's the same thing. Simulate it again and there we go. Our pockets are ready now. Now let's move on to the big ones, the big pockets right here. I'm going to turn the show internal lines checkbox again so that we can see exactly what we're doing. Now to approach this, let's first see the reference. So the reference is clearly faking this one because this is supposed to be a flap, right? So we should be able to see right through this, but this is joined somehow. So you can tell that this is just a sculpt and this is just like a stamp detail that they put on ZBrush or something. But yeah, we're going to actually recreate it. This is the pocket. We already have the outline and there is a flap that goes on top of it, which is connected by buttons. And this outer pocket right here has 2 seam lines. So that's all we need to keep in mind. And now let's start creating it. The first step would be to somehow get a total replica of this entire shape and then project it on top so that we get the outer shape, right? That's pretty easy to do actually if you just go to the trace tool right here, which you can quickly do by pressing I. Select this area right here and also make sure to select the boundary. And now if you right click and select trace as pattern, we get an exact replica of this shape as a new pattern. So we can also do that on the other side. And now let's select these middle segments here and just merge them. So that's how we get a really nice replica of these two shapes here. Actually, I'm going to keep these segments and I'm only going to remove them later. Now, here it is in our 3D viewport. Let's rotate it, bring it closer, and now we're going to stitch it. So that's fairly easy to do here. Just connect this part. So as you can see, it is connected on this part. You can also just do it in the 3D viewport here directly. So that's fairly easy to do. Right there, right there. I'm going to keep the top open because it's a pocket. So let's just simulate it. And there we go. Nice little pocket flap we got going on there. And since it doesn't look that thick in the reference, I didn't actually create any flaps for it that make it stick out. But you can also do that by just offsetting the pattern outline and then stitching that part instead of this directly. Anyway, I'll stop rambling and get on with it. Now, even if we kept the top open, this is like exactly at the edge, which is not really realistic because the opening should be right around here somewhere, right? So we can simply select this line here and also this one, right click and offset as internal line. And you will see right here what it does. We don't want to extend it to the pattern outline. We just want to extend it to the internal line. Let's go 10 millimeter. That looks about right and hit OK. And this will give us a nice little line right here. And apparently this one went above. So we're just going to repeat it here. Internal. If you check this reverse direction button, it'll just fix that really quickly. And there we go. We have this little margin here now to work with. We'll also do the same right here so that we know where to stitch it. Okay, awesome. Now I'm going to select this entire internal line and extend it to the pattern outline and add a point. And I'm also going to select this point here, select this line and add point to intersection. And I'm going to do the same thing right here. And now we should be able to just simply slide down our segment sewing to fit these new segments. We should also just be able to delete these extra points and simulate again. And also make sure that the layer is set to 2. So this, if this is 1, this should be 2. And now if you simulate it, there we go. We have a nice little pocket right here. And now all that's left to do is just to create the flap, which is really easy to do. We can just copy this one, delete this extra point, right click, offset the pattern outline, and we're going to retract it. So let's retract it by 85 looks nice, so let's hit OK. And now let's work on the sewing. So again, we're just going to use the segment sewing, the MN segment sewing tool. Select this segment here and this segment here, press enter, and select this one, press enter again. And this should create the relationship that we want. Just simulate it again. And there we have our little flap here. Awesome. You can play around with the shape a little bit, make it a little wider perhaps, so that it fits more nicely. Also maybe make it a bit bigger. So a bit longer right here. I think this looks pretty nice. And now let's add the buttons. So how do you do that? Luckily, it's very easy in Marvelous Designer. You just go here, select button, and the button is going to be here somewhere. So I'm just going to click. There we go. So it's this pattern here. So I'm just going to do the second one right here and go to buttonhole and then add the buttonholes here and here. And now to fasten them, we use the fasten button tool. Just select the button and then the buttonhole, press simulate, and there we go. We have our buttons. And if you want to customize these to look exactly like the one in the reference, you just go to the button window, select the default button, and now we can look for a shape that matches our reference more closely. So maybe something like this one, and the size should be smaller. So let's go for 10. That's probably way too small, so 15 maybe. And for the buttonhole, you can do the same. Go to the buttonhole window, select the buttonhole, and then change the width. So I'm gonna do 15. Okay, perfect. Now lastly, we want to add these crease lines right here. So a really simple way to fake these would be to just select the two edges here of the outside pocket and then right click, offset as internal line along curved. Crank up the number of offsets to 2. This should give us exactly what we want. So right there, hit OK. And if you pump up the fold strength here, press simulate. And if we hide the internal lines for a second, you can see that we get these creases here. Very nice. Now we just need to copy this pocket to this side, and that's fairly simple. If you know, you just select everything, press Ctrl D, duplicate to this side. Hit simulate again, and there we go. We have our pockets. Very nice. Let's go. Go. Yeah. Ooh. Okay, I just realized that the pockets are actually way too small. Way too small. I got carried away. What can I say? Now with this method, it's going to be really hard to actually change the size of the pockets after we're done. So yeah, just keep in mind that you don't want to do that. But yeah, if you look closely here, this line is supposed to go through the pocket here. And that's one of the problems that I was going to discuss, but apparently our pocket turned out too small. So let's just get rid of these lines, and I'm going to start these lines from scratch just to show you how you can tackle this. So I'm going to use the line tool again for this part. Let's first hide our pockets though. So select our pockets and right click and select hide 3D pattern. Select the line tool, and we're going to draw a line right here, going across in a circular manner, connected to the front again. So there we have our line. And now if we go to the edit line tool, right click, convert to internal shape, get rid of this extra point and the back pattern as well. And now we have a circular line going through the pocket here. Let's create the bottom one as well. Go to the edit line tool, right click, convert to internal shape, and then delete these extra points. Nice. Now if we want these nice looking 3D seam lines here, select this line and the back pattern as well. Right click and cut and sew. So this will cut it from the pattern and then sew it back again. So we have a nice little seam line right there. So once it's done, you can see we should be able to see this really nice seam line going across the pants. Now do the same for this one as well. Now since we've already made the pockets, it's not going to matter that this is going through the pockets. So just select them, right click, cut and sew. And now it's even harder to adjust our pockets. I'm sorry. This is why we kept this part for the last, so that we are done with our pockets and then we can move on to cutting these. And yeah, just make sure you don't do this. Make sure you pay attention to the size of your things. Right, so our pants are almost done. Now what's left is to work on the J-stitch. If we check here, since we drew the J-stitch right here, it also got carried over to the left side because we had symmetry on. So we're going to remove this linked editing feature by right-clicking and selecting this option right here. And then we can freely remove this line. And now we only have the J-stitch on the right side, exactly how we want it right here. And now we want an exact replica of the J-stitch, so we can stitch this part right here and it'll have a flap. So we're going to use the tracing tool again. Select these parts, trace as a pattern, put it right here. Let's see where it is. Bring it closer. And now just sew this right here, simulate it, and we have to work on the layering. So put it to 2. Simulate again, and there we have our J-stitch. Now we have to make it a little longer so that it extends to here into the waistband. And if we check the measurements of the waistband, so it's 32 here, so we need to extend this by 32. So right click on this edge, offset pattern outline, we're going to extend it by 32 right there. Hit OK. Now we can select these points, convert them to curve points, and there we have a clean J-stitch flap. Let's figure out where we want to connect it. So if we click right here, you'll see the blue dot appears right here as well. Draw a line going straight right there, extend it to the pattern outline, use the free sewing to sew this part to this part on the waistband, hit simulate. Now let's fix the straightness of this front part here, so we can just play around with the curvature, and there we have it. Now the next step is usually to add the zipper inside the J-stitch and the button. But since all of it is going to be hidden by our tank top here, so we're just going to ignore that. We're not even going to add the zip because it only introduces more problems. We're just going to leave it as is. But yeah, let's just quickly remove the linked editing from here and get rid of this extra line here. And yeah, I think we are basically done with the pants. I just forgot one little detail. So that would be the back pockets. So if you check in the reference, there's a little sliver of what you can call a back pocket. So we're just going to fake this because I don't see any bulge coming out right here that would suggest or that would require us to create an inside of a pocket. So this should be pretty easy to do. Select right here. I'm going to use the line tool again. Create a nice little rectangle. Very simple like that. Now let's also add another line in between going straight like this. Now let's add a point right here. Add point to intersection. Add point to intersection. Now I'm just going to simply trace this one out as a pattern and stitch it back right here. Set the layer to 2, hit simulate it, and there we go. We have a nice little detail here that looks like a pocket, but it's not really a pocket, but I think it gets the job done. So just duplicate it to the other side, simulate it, and I think we are done with the pants. Let's go. Okay, now we have our pants and we also have our tank top. So let's reactivate the tank top and see how it fits. So I'm going to select the tank top, right click, show 3D pattern, and then right click in the 3D viewport and press activate. And there we go. There's our tank top here. It's set to layer 1 and I want to change it to layer 2 so that it works properly. Probably layer 3 since this one is set to 2 as well. So yeah, that's perfect. And judging by the excess of gathering here, this pattern is way too long right now. So let's try and decrease this a bit. So I'll bring that up and bring this up as well. Something like this. J-stitch is getting in the way. I'll probably just tack this part to the waistband so it doesn't move. So use the tack tool and click on the J-stitch and then the waistband. And I do want to mention that I've went over all of these tools that you see here, like everything that you see in Marvelous Designer, I've already went through in the earlier sections. So if you haven't watched them yet, just go ahead and watch them. I've also put the timestamps in the video and also in the comment section for the detailed ones. If I use a tool here that you do not understand properly, you can just go ahead and take a look at the detailed explanation. Since it's sliding up every time we bring it back, the problem is that this bottom section is not as wide as we'd like it. So let's just make it a bit wider right here. Maybe for the back pattern as well. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Let's play around with the placement. Still way too strong. I think I'm gonna put a seam tape in there for the bottom part. So just select them and go to seam taping and turn this on. This should help keep its shape a little more intact. So if we manage to put it right here. Okay, that's not too bad. I like the little slant that it's doing right here. And also doesn't hide the details that we worked so hard on. Show it off a little bit more, you know? But yeah, it looks way too loose right now. I think the culprit is also because of her proportions. Like you can see here in the reference, Lara Croft's body is quite a bit straighter than what we have going on here. It's really curvy. I'm just going to play around with it and try to get some wrinkles that I'm happy with first. You'd think that watching a video like this would give you a secret tip or technique that lets you create any kind of clothing that you want, but you know, it's just about fiddling around mostly. And I've never learned a thing about fashion designing, so I can't really help you there. Okay, so after playing around with it for a while, I've got something like this, and I think I'm pretty happy with it. I've also frozen the pants because I didn't want to lose this progress, because I just made these pockets a little bigger, and I also added another internal line here to define the crease a little bit more. I also dropped the particle distance down to 5, simulated it, and then froze it, so it's not going anywhere now. Anyway, let's do the same for the tank top. Let's drop this to 5. It's gonna take a second. Okay, now simulate it. Nice. And now we're gonna get these really crisp wrinkles, which I really love. And I think we are done with the basic elements of our outfit. So the tank top is ready, as well as the pants, the pockets. And now we're going to start with the belt, the gun holster, right? So this, the gun holster, the belt, the main one. And I'm going to show you how to make this big belt. And your assignment would be to create these smaller ones. So this one, I'll show you where it goes and how it connects and everything. But I'm just going to show you how to make one belt because it is probably the most tedious part of the process. So yeah, let's actually get into it. Okay, now let's go to edit background image. We're going to reset it because we don't need the image anymore. Let's put the pants to the side as well as the tank top. And let's just focus on creating the belt. So start around the waist. So right about here where we want the belt to be. You can check the reference for this. Let's start with a rectangle. I'm going to draw it like this. So it's very similar to how you'd create the waistband. Now Shift F, we want to wrap it around the waist again. So that's fine. Let's go ahead, duplicate it to the other side, stitch it, same as before, quick and easy. And oh yeah, we want to set the layers to, what will it be? 4? Yeah, 4. So the tank top was 3, so the belt has to be 4. So set the layer to 4. Now let's simulate it. Boom, very nice. And also I want to quickly get rid of this edge here. I just want to merge it because this is where our buckle will go and I don't want an unnecessary edge right there. So yeah, we have a clean base to start off with now. I've already prepared this buckle object in Blender. So let me just import it real quick. So I'll go to File, Import Add, OBJ, and just select the buckle here. We want to set the object type to trim. Hit OK. Now apparently our center has shifted as well. So let's just actually get rid of these 2 points. Now we have this buckle object right here. If you click on this little icon here that you see here, you can actually attach it to any kind of garment. We'll fix the rotation later, but let's just fix the scale first because it's massive right now. Something like that. Now, click on the center, click this button right here and attach it somewhere right there. We're going to fine tune it later, but let's just keep it here for now. Now the first step is to create a section of the belt that will be hidden behind the buckle because we don't really have the freedom to create a physically accurate belt that goes around the loop and it collides and there's an actual gap here. But yeah, we don't have that freedom here because it'll introduce a lot of instability, which we don't want when we're animating, or especially for stuff like belts where there are lots of trims because it's really easy to go wrong with them. And I actually learned this method from YouTube. I'll link the original video down in the description so that you can check it out, but I'll just show you how I like to do it. I'll just press here, find this point here, I'll add a line. Just follow along because it's kind of hard to explain, but once we actually finish it, then everything will make sense. Right, so then we also want another line right here. Let's extend them to the pattern outline. There we go. And now I'm going to cut this part, cut it out like this. So there we have a separate piece, and then we have 2 different pieces right here. Now it would be really easy for us if we just decide to merge these 2 points and convert it into one single belt. So I'll do just that, remove this, and now we have one belt and one of these little guys for just this segment right here. Now, the first step is to create the loop that goes around the buckle. So it's this part right here. I'm going to take it and I'm going to extend it by a little bit. So let's go 20 millimeter and I'll check create internal line because I want to keep this line right here so that we can just stitch it across. You'll get what I'm trying to say soon. So just hit OK for now. We'll get an extension from right here. There we go. You can see this extension, right? Let's fold it to make it a little more obvious. There we go. Actually, we want to fold it inwards, but let's just fold it outwards and then we'll push it in later. But yeah, this is the extension. And now let's fix the sewing real quick because it's attached to this part. If you see, yeah, this part is sewn to this part. So this is not what we want. So let's just quickly delete it and then sew this original segment to this one. So it's this one and this one. Sew it together and now we shouldn't have any problems. By the way, I think the fact that these are only frozen and not deactivated is causing a lot of performance hit. Deactivate the pattern and sewing, and I'm just going to hide them for now so that we can focus on our build. We will need to resimulate it later when we unhide the patterns again, but this gives us a lot of room to focus on our belt now. So there we go, much more responsive already. So we can see that we haven't actually attached the buckle correctly. So let's do that again. There we go. If you go to the trim window right here, select the belt buckle that we just imported and set the weight in grams right here to 0, because otherwise it just weighs down the whole belt and gives us a little bit of unpredictable results sometimes. So I learned that it's best to just turn it off and work like this. Let's also bring the particle distance down to 10 so that we have a little more wiggle room to play around with. All right, there we go. Nice. Let's just continue folding this extension back to this part here and just stitch it here so that we have a nice loop going around the buckle. The way I like to do it is, let's first adjust this segment here. I'm going to use the fold arrangement tool again, fold it like so. And now I'm going to do another extension. So another 10 millimeter right there. Fold this part as well. And now we can see where we need to stitch it. I'm just going to click here. This is where we might want to stitch it. And actually from here to here, it's exactly 20 mm. So if we just go 20 mm on the other side, that should be it. But okay, we can go maybe like 15 mm here so that there's a little bit of extra wiggle room here and we can just create the loop out of that. If that's confusing, you'll see what I mean soon. Offset this as an internal line, set it to 15 mm. Let's extend it. And now we can just stitch this part to here, simulate it, and you can see that we're kind of getting the basic shape of the loop already. Let's bring this guy back. Boom. Okay, right there. Let's use the select mesh box tool. Select this part here. So all of this, maybe just this one. Yeah. And just push it back like that. Push it back. And I'm going to select the buckle again and push it back as well. Right there. Simulate it, and now the loop forms behind the belt, which is exactly what we want because it usually isn't stitched to the front. Now let's work on the curvature of this loop a bit more. So if we check here, the loop is from here to, click here. Yeah. So between these two lines. So I'm just going to right click, offset as internal line along curved, and set the number of curves to something high, like maybe 7. Yeah, that sounds good. Hit OK. Simulate it again. And now we have a much smoother loop back there. I think for a better look, we want to sew this part to somewhere back there. Let's just delete the sewing gear here and sew it to this line. Just simulate it. And now we can see this is much better. Yes. So we've got the loop working nicely. Like it's a very basic one, but this sets the foundation. So you can do other stuff like maybe stitch this and create another line here and just stitch it there, which will create a nicer loop. You can also tighten this loop up by changing some of the internal angles from here, the fold angles. But I just want to show you the concept of creating the belts first. Okay, so the next step is to extend this part so that it moves through here, and then we can put a little loop here and then pass it through, and that'll complete our belts. So let's do that. It's this part right here. So I'm just going to select it, offset pattern outline, make sure the create internal line is checked. And I think I'm going to extend it by, let's say 50 millimeter, hit OK. Okay, so there we have an extension of this part. If you fold it up, there it is, right? Let's extend it a bit more. Okay, it messed up the sewing part here. So I'm just going to remove it, and we have to stitch it back to this part here. Click here, click on this, simulate it. And there we go. We have an extension of this part now. Now we want to loop it through, stitch it somewhere around here so that it doesn't move. So stitch this edge to somewhere around here. It doesn't have to be super accurate. So I'm just going to draw a line and extend it to the pattern outline. We're just going to stitch it directly. Hit simulate. There we have it. There is a bit of looseness here that I don't really like. We might have to push the line back a bit. So let's try 10 millimeter. There we go. Now this is nice and tight. But we can see that the loop is right here, very close to the buckle. So we might have to adjust it accordingly. So instead of stitching it right here, you might want to stitch it somewhere around here. So that would mean just pushing this back. Let's try 30 and also decrease this by 30. Now this should work. There we go. So now it's much closer to the buckle and you can push it further if you want, but yeah, I'm happy with it. Now usually what everybody recommends is that you just click here, you find this point and you just create an ellipse here, something like this, and you just right click here and convert it to a hole. This is a normal way to do it, and I have done it for the original recreation that I did first for this outfit. So yeah, this is doable, but the problem is when you go ahead and add this eyelet object here, this is another trim object that you can find in Marvelous Designer actually, and it is found in the presets. When you add these, it has to attach somewhere above or on the sides or below the actual hole, because you cannot attach a trim directly to a hole. It doesn't make any sense. So what ends up happening is after you simulate it, it starts shifting to where you actually tagged it. So that's a bit of a problem that I encountered while using holes. So instead of turning this into a hole, what I'd recommend you to do instead is add a new fabric, and in the property editor, just change the opacity to 0%. And now you want to select this ellipse, you want to right click, you want to cut and sew, right? So it cuts it and then it sews it back. So there's basically no change. But now what you can do is you can select this ellipse pattern. So it's not an internal shape anymore. It's a separate pattern. So that means you can apply this new fabric to this pattern and it'll just basically make it invisible. So if you want to add an eyelet here, so let's just try and add an eyelet here. So it's in the buttons folder. So what that means is we can just simply use the button tool, click on the ellipse, and then go to the button window, add a new button, change this type to the eyelet that we saw, and make sure this button is set to this eyelet. Now you can play around with the sizing and everything, but what this does is that it basically just going to stay here no matter what you do with the belt. So it's not going anywhere. So it'll be exactly, not exactly actually, but pretty close to where the original hole is. So you can just play around with it. There's no problem with that. But yeah, it's going to stay around this part. Like if you did it the other way and just made it a hole, it would always like scoop way off to the side. So that's not something that we want. And this is a method that works much better than the other one. So just try that. Right, anyway, this back piece, this piece right here, this one that we created at first, this is also supposed to be transparent. So we'll give it the fabric too. And there we go, it's transparent and we already have a basis. I know it's very ugly right now, but this is really the basis of how to create a belt in Marvelous Designer. I will show you a better example after this, but let's just stick with it. Fix this rotation. I mean, you get the point, right? It goes through this hole, there's a loop here, it's connected. And now, to hide the fact that I just stitched it here, I'm going to add a really nice and small belt loop right there. Rectangle tool, very simple. And now to create the loop, we have to extend both of these parts. So let's just offset these parts. Let's go for 7. Extend it by 7 mm. Bring it even closer. Fold it right here. And also right here. Fold it there. And now we just have to extend it again. And we're going to stitch the ends like so. So what this will do in theory is it'll connect on the inside right here. If you press simulate, oops, we have to increase the particle distance of this loop by quite a bit. But let's just try with 10 for now. And as you can see, we need more particle distance. So bring it down to 5. Still way too tight. So what I'm going to do is select this, double tap on the center, and I'll just make it bigger. And now if you simulate it, yeah, this is fitting. Okay, this is very loose, but you get the point. This is how you create the loop. And this is just to hide the fact that you have put a stitch there. And now you can just go ahead and extend this part again. So maybe like 10, just to get that extra bit outside the loop. Okay, that was way too small. So let's just do it manually. Okay, there we go. That extra bit right here. And make sure the stitching is correct again. So there we go. There's a loop. There's the extra bit after the loop. The buckle is correctly positioned. Okay, Yeah, not exactly correctly, but if you put a little bit more time than me on this, so you can get a really nice result. Don't make any like really harsh and random movements, and it should be fine. And yeah, basically once you get it into place, then you should try to not move it as much. So once we unhide our patterns again and we resimulate it and get the position that we want, we'll try to just keep it there by putting a lot of heavy fabrics. So if you go here and if you change this physical property here, the preset, if you choose a heavier fabric, so like denim maybe, or there's even leather, I think. Yeah, so there's leather as well. So you try to use something like that so that it doesn't really deform that easily. So that's the whole point of how to make a belt. And now let me show you what it look like after you put a bit of time into it. So I'll just cut at this part and show you the final result. Right, so with just a little bit of tweaking, this is where I'm at. You can see that there's a huge quality difference between what we started with and what it currently is right now. And yeah, with just a little bit of time, you can expect to see results like these if you just understand the fundamentals and how to build from there. Now let's take a look at the gun holster, because you already know how to make the belts. So we can figure out how to create these extra belts and then attach it to the main belt. So there's one belt right here. It attaches to the main belt from the back side. And basically you can think of this part as like a huge belt loop with a button on it. And for this part, it's not clear where it is actually attaching, so you can just basically attach it behind the belt like anywhere that you want, and it won't really be visible, so it doesn't really matter. So this is another belt that goes from here and it attaches to this buckle. And there's another belt here that is only extended to this part, and it goes through the buckle and through the loop here. And for this leg harness belt here, this is pretty much the same as this one, but just smaller, and it's flipped. So it goes through here. So it goes from the right to the left here, but it goes from the left to the right there. Pretty simple to figure out once you know how to make a single belt. So let's focus on how to actually create this gun holster part. So this bit here, where it's sitting, and this extra bit here, which sits on top of this base here, if you can call it that. And let's also figure out how to create these loops here that hold the gun holster together. Luckily, since this is a AAA game, you can easily find references of the actual thing from ArtStation posted by the original creator. So this is absolutely A grade reference right here. Is the actual thing, so we can see exactly how this was created. So this belt goes through the gun holster and is probably attached somewhere here, or maybe it loops back to somewhere right here and it's attached like that. Doesn't really matter, it doesn't show anywhere. But yeah, let's focus on the gun holster here. You can see that it's just a rectangle back here and it's stitched to this front bit. Since we have this clear of a view, we can already see what the shape would be like, what the pattern would be like. So this bit, it's attached to the base, it's attached to this front piece, and the front piece is attached to the base again. Pretty simple, right? So let's break it down and see how we can create it. I'm actually just going to freeze the belt and not deactivate it because I still need it as a reference to see exactly where the gun holster goes. So yeah, let's just keep it there. Let's just push it to the side so that it doesn't obstruct our view maybe. Okay, so let's start with this super basic pattern. So I'm trying to find a nice view of the thing. Yeah, this is it. So we're going to see exactly what the shape of the base looks like. I'm going to start with the polygon tool. Let's find that view again. Okay. So there's going to be a corner, obviously, something like that. And a curve right around here. Wait, so a corner right here, a curve right here, and then goes through to another corner, a longer one right there. I'm just eyeballing it. There's no math to it. It's all chill. Just don't worry about it. Just let it flow. It's insanely big right now, but we will fix it after we finish it. So it's something like this. The shape, the base of the shape, this part right here. Let's scale it down, put it closer to the body so we have a better idea of the actual shape, actual size, I mean. I've been working on this project this ultimate guide for so long that I'm starting to slur my words here. So yeah, just forgive me. I hope this is bringing value to you guys at least, because I never want to do this again. Never. Anyway, yeah, there we have it. Looks okay to me. Now let's focus on this curve right here and this part. So again, the polygon tool, I'm going to select this fabric here, start with the corner. We can go right here, something like that. So there we go. So if you're familiar with the pen tool in Photoshop or Illustrator, things like this should be pretty easy to recreate. Let's position it right around here. Now we have a pretty good sense of the scale because we already have set up the base here. Now we can tweak it according to the base of the shape. Okay, perfect. Now we have a really good idea of what the scale is. So I need to make it a little bit bigger. And now for the side piece, we will worry about it later. I'll just freeze this one. Okay, fantastic. Now select this edge here, Control C, Control V, and I'm gonna paste it right next to this. Just paste it and it'll become an internal line right there. Perfect. So you can see that it became an internal line of this pattern right here. Now all we have to do is just stitch it here and here. Now if you simulate it, there we have the first part. And now we have to create this rectangle here. Okay, I think I'll just make a rectangle. Now we can see that there is a little bit of an indent to the stitch. A sizable portion of it is stitched to this pattern right here, the front pattern. So I'm just going to create an internal line. Just going to offset it as an internal line. Maybe like 5 yeah, that should do the trick. And extend it, yeah. And I'm also gonna offset this one as well. So offset as internal line, 5 all good. And now all we need to do is, yeah, so this part is flipped. So let me just turn that around like that. And there are going to be some flipped normals here and there, which we can fix later easily. But let's just focus on creating the actual garment now. This actually goes to the outside. This goes on the inside. That's perfect. So we got this part ready. Now all we have to do is just stitch it to this base here. And that should be pretty easy too. But let me just get this out of the way so that we can see what we're working on here. I'm going to make this a tad bit thicker. Offset an internal line. I'm going to copy this internal line and paste it right here. I'm going to use the transform pointer segment tool and select this one. And now we can easily rotate it and place it on the side. Something like that. Let's see how it is attached actually. Okay, so it does have a bit of a curve here. So maybe we can recreate it pretty easily. Bring it here, give it a bit of a curve, maybe a little bit here as well. Play around with the handles. I think this is pretty nice. And now we can stitch this one to this one. So we want this little curve right here. So we're leaving a bit of access to the side. At least that's my plan. So let's see what happens. So simulate it. Okay, let's set the layer. What's the layer here? Okay, the layer is 0. So this one, so it goes on top of everything. So it must be like 5. Yeah. Okay, we're getting that extra bit of access over there, but it's not really round. But it doesn't really matter because this is probably just slapped onto there. And how would you even stitch it like that, like as a curve? So yeah, this is fine, I think. Push all of it inside though. So it'll also stop jittering then. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, we're getting there. Now there we go. That is the holster. Now if we use some stronger fabrics, this will stay more in shape. Add a new fabric. I have no organization skills, so I'm just going to call it fabric 3 right here. Let's use trim full grain leather, but turn down the bending and biases because these are way too much. Yeah, this is way too much. Maybe this could be 85, 85, 85. This should be fine. Select these, go down and click on this button to assign them to this new fabric. Now if you simulate it, yeah, you can see how much more rigid it feels. So this is perfect. We also probably want this nice little edge right here. So yeah, you can do that by just offsetting this internal line, or maybe just drawing another one here and just increasing the fold angle. So that should do the trick. And for these loops here, so it's probably meant to be the leg loop going inside and then out again. Yeah, it's totally faked. So there's no way that's happening. We don't really need to care about the realism so much. So we can just focus on creating a little loop here and then attaching it right there and there. Just simple rectangles stitched directly on to the base right here. So that's pretty easy. And I'll finish the holster with the extra details that I just mentioned, and I'll get back to you in a second. Okay, so this is what the finished holster looks like. Yeah, I didn't really need the extra internal line right here. I just had to make it slanting and a bit wider, so that did the trick. It made it curved and like a bit inflated. And this part right here, I just decided to stitch both of these parts to the base, so that worked out fine. Looks nice. And for the loops, yeah, it's just basically directly attached to these parts right here. I also made a little cutout for the the belt to pass through, and then it will attach to right here. So it's all simple stuff really. Once you get how to make this belt right here, and you have also created the pants and the tank tops, you'll have enough practice to get into something like this, where it's just like following, like reading the reference really carefully and then breaking it down into what could actually be the patterns for it. So maybe seeing my workflow helped a little bit. Let me know. This is the first time I'm doing like a live tutorial like this, so my presentation skills are really bad. I know that. I know it is really painful to watch me, okay? I get it. But yeah, the other parts are just belts and stuff. So let me just quickly add them, and then I'll give a quick little breakdown of how I added them. So yeah, just give me a second. Okay, so this is the actual like original file for what I first created for this outfit. So you can see the finished holster here, all attached to the belt and everything. And this is the problem I was talking about earlier, like with the actual holes. If you cut the actual holes, it shifts to the right ever so slightly, because there's no way you can attach the buttons to the actual holes, because there can be a button if there's a hole, right? You know what I mean. But anyway, if you check the whole outfit really, you can see there are way less creases here. And I'm actually happier with how our new pant turned out, because it has all those creases here. Looks really nice. And also the crease right here, which is similar to the original reference. So I'm really happy about that. The tank top is much nicer in the original though. This is basically the shape for it. And I also offset the pattern outlines as internal lines and trace them out like this, and then stitch them back on top. Now let me show you the holster. So I'm just going to hide all of this real quick. So this belt right here is attached directly on top here. I just have a little internal line, and it just attaches right behind in this internal line. So that's pretty simple. And then it goes here. It has a loop, like I said, and then there's another belt here, and this belt is connected to the gun holster from the back, like I mentioned, and goes through this hole. And then, yeah, this is all just bells and whistles. It's really just simple stuff. Like like I said, once you get the fundamentals, this is like really easy. And it also depends a lot on your creativity, how you actually break down the references. And it's just a lot of practice, I'd say. So I already explained all of the theory part. If you're stuck anywhere, or if you have any ideas, like for example, I didn't really talk about the specifics of this menu here. Like when you select a pattern, there's all of this extra info. And when you select a fabric, like there's a lot of stuff that you can change right here, which is really contextual, and this would be like 5 hours long if I decide to do that. So I just skipped over it. But if you really need the info on that part as well, just let me know. I'll just make an updated segment to this tutorial and just post it on my channel for free, don't worry. Or maybe if that's not possible, I'll just make a PDF containing all the documentation for this part. I know the official Marvelous Designer documentation is a little weak, but yeah, finally this last belt right here is it just simply attaches to the holster in this segment right here, this internal line. And I put one of these trims here just to hide the fact and really just to match the reference properly. So if you check right here, yeah, there we have the trim. That's where I decided to add it. And it attaches to the top. You can see how it attaches in the reference. That's exactly what I did. It simply just goes from the back and attaches to the main belt, just like the front part. So it's just an internal line. And to cover that fact, I've just created a loop, a big loop in this shape. And I just put a little button on there to make it look nice. For this top stitch part, you can refer to, I'll put the timestamp somewhere right here. And basically you can watch that part to learn how I did the top stitch for this part. Now finally, once you have everything ready and it's all good to go, you need to bring it back into Unreal, right? So just keep Marvelous Designer open. That's fine. Go back to Unreal Engine and go to the Marvelous Designer Live Sync Editor and simply click on this 3 buttons. Check Unified Material if you're using materials like Substance Painter and stuff, and click on this button. This will give you a little warning, just like heads up. So it says, make sure to turn off the simulation. Make sure to be in either simulation mode or UV editor mode in Clo or Marvelous Designer. Doesn't really matter. It's pretty much the same software. So you can't be in like sculpt mode or anything like that. And you also want to make sure that no animation is currently being recorded. You don't want to hit this record button and then try to export it. It'll lead to a crash. Let's hope for the best. Click on this button. Hit OK. Moment of truth. Okay, guys, there we go. That's our garment right there. And it looks awesome. All right, now how do you use it? So you want to first select this garment item right here and then click on Save Selected Object. Now, depending on if you want to save it as a static mesh or a geometry cache, that's up to you. If you have animation on your garment, then you want to go for a geometry cache. But since I only plan to use it for a single pose, I'm just going to go for a static mesh, and it imported the right pose anyway. So yeah, let's just go for that. I'm going to save it at the content folder, call it outfit. Hit save. And there we have our outfit. We can bring it in to our world, reset the location, select our avatar, reset her location, and now we should be able to select both of them and bring them up like so. Go to the sequencer, change the pose, and there we have our own Lara Croft right inside of Unreal Engine. Okay, and you might be wondering about this part, like how do you hide this? So you can take the source textures and bring it into a software like Photoshop or Blender and or maybe even Substance Painter and just, paint over it. Just use something like the heal brush or something, like patch it out. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to get rid of this top part right here. And yeah, I am dying. Yeah, I think that's it. Like if you want to go ahead and texture it, you can just export it directly from Marvelous Designer. So you go to File, Export, and use like OBJ, FBX, Lembe. It doesn't really matter since it's just a static object. So go ahead and do that. Take it into a software like Substance Painter, paint it, and then you should have a result like this. Alright, you made it to the end. If you watched this video in its entirety, you now have a solid foundation in Marvelous Designer and have created a full production-ready outfit from scratch. This was a massive deep dive for me, and I really hope it gave you the knowledge and confidence to start creating your own garments. If you found this guide helpful, let me know in the comments and subscribe to the channel to not miss out on such future videos. If you end up creating something from this video, make sure to tag me at Renderides on Instagram, and I would love to see it. To make your workflow even easier, I put together the essential pattern overlay collection for Marvelous Designer and Clo 3D, which you can use as a guide in Marvelous Designer to create the basic building blocks of your future garments. You can find it in the description along with my PureRef reference board, so you can also follow along and create your own Lara Croft outfit. The finished project file is also available as a paid resource, allowing you to break it down and use it in your own projects. This video took over a year of researching, scripting, planning, recording, editing, the whole charade. So if you want to support this kind of content, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. You'll get exclusive perks, behind the scenes content, and early access to my future projects. If you're serious about learning 3D, join the Renderverse. It's a gamified way of learning 3D in our Renderites Discord server, where you can earn XP and level up and redeem your XP for free courses, products, and a lot of cool stuff. Now there's only one question left. What if you could bypass all of this and create stunning clothing in a matter of minutes? Watch this video next and I'll show you how you can skip the entire pattern making process and use high quality ready-made garments to speed up your workflow without sacrificing quality. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.